Lads!
All right, lads, are you ready? Carrick Draz, here we come. Can we be heard?
Yes. Can y'all hear us? Please let us know. We would really appreciate that, because otherwise it's just us talking to each other, but not.
Here we go. Yeah, looking forward to this one. You can hear us. That sounds good.
You're good.
I'm really looking forward to this topic because it is surprisingly somewhat of a personal one for me, as I will discuss when I do my inevitable intro. But Carrick Draz is a fun place, and as I think you'll find as we make our way through it, it brings up lots of interesting questions about orcs in general.
Yeah, so this is going to be... This one's very interesting because me and Andy, when we were discussing about what to put on this particular poll, we had the idea of like, oh, we should do a Greenskin place. And then we both kind of sat there for a second as our eyes slowly started squinting harder and harder going, well, all of these places are technically other people's places that the Greenskin took up residence on. And there tends to be less Greenskin lore than the original owner's lore. And after hemming and hawing over it, we finally settled on Black Crag because it's one of the very few where there's more Greenskin stuff than there is dwarf stuff going on. But that proved an interesting mental challenge for a little bit.
It did. And as you'll find through the course of this stream, it's a location that has an interesting history. It's not the biggest, most in-depth of histories, but it does have a few interesting characters that are attached to it. One of which we will most certainly be discussing at length because, well, it's about time we had a bit of orky fun at this side.
Yeah, easily my favorite Greenskin character, so I'm really, really excited for that. And yes, of course, it is worth noting the happy affiliate anniversary to the LAWhammer Twitch channel, by the way.
Really?
They've reached a year of being affiliated, so good for them. Money, hooray.
I was fully aware of that. I mean, what difference does that? Does it make any difference other than happy birthday to us?
It's just a like, woo.
Happy birthday to us. Happy birthday, dear LAWhammer. Indeed, today, perhaps in celebration of that, I will even be discussing where the name LAWhammer first came from, because it's actually related to this in a very weird tangential way.
You know, it's funny. For most people, it would just be, I literally just took my name and applied it to hammer because, haha. But I feel like with you, it's going to be something longer than that. And it's going to go, of course it is, Andy. Of course it's longer than that.
It's really not.
Okay.
It's that. But why that is, going to pop up. Alrighty, has everybody gathered? Are we good to get started?
Yeah, I think we've given everyone enough time. Let's hop into it.
Anything you'd like to say before we begin?
Yes, the only thing I'll say, just in case you're here at the beginning and not the end, is that this Wednesday we'll be on the Loremaster of Sotek channel. We're going to be playing Total War together for the first time. So that'll be interesting and fun. I still don't know exactly what we're doing. I don't know if we're going to figure that out before then or not, but that'll be
we're going to try.
Quick note, we will be starting an hour earlier than normal. So instead of starting at 6 p.m. CST and midnight BST, we'll start at 5 p.m. CST and 11 p.m. BST, so we give ourselves a little bit more time. And get to bed at a more reasonable hour. But
I mean, knowing us, will we?
Yeah, knowing us, probably not. But I mean, to be fair, the right stream was a little extreme. It got a wee bit out of hand.
Yeah, just a little bit. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was one of those rare streams where by the end of it, I felt like not that much time had passed for all it had been over 5 hours of us talking about the Empire. So if you haven't watched that stream already, that's on this channel, isn't it? So you can go watch that over on the YouTube LAWhammer channels right now, where we discuss the great provinces of the Empire for over 5 hours. And we then allow the community to rate them. And that has some interesting results, which I do recommend you go watch.
You may go, 5 hours? That must have been exhaustive. No, we barely touched on any of the shit that we would have liked to. It felt like it was like, no, we have to keep going.
Keep going, because there was so much to cover, but it was really good.
Last other things are that at the end of this stream, we'll talk about what's going to be next week over on the Loremaster of Sotek channel. Though if you've seen the poll, you probably know what it is, but I'm not going to say it until the end of the stream. And then the next vote will be on this stream after this stream is over for the following week.
Yep.
just
That'll be popping up over on the LAWhammer YouTube channel. We'll be posting links for that around about half an hour or so after we're finished doing the stream today. So the last thing that I've got to say is that, as always, we're going to have a variety of comments and super chats coming in, some of which we'll bring up. On the super chat side, we'll be taking those in batches because we like to have a quick chat about everything that you bring up. So if you do bring a super chat on, we will be bringing that up, but not necessarily when you post it in, but we will bring it up during the course of the stream. Other than that, do you have anything you'd like to add, or are we into the first batch of super chats?
I think we can go ahead and do that.
Okay. Yeah. I'll just double check that there was no bitsy bits because I wasn't paying attention to the chat.
There wasn't. I've got it up.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Just want to say I've been looking forward to Lorebeards all week, and if we ever get a Fishman DLC, the community owes you both a great debt. Yeah, sure. Why not? I'll take credit for that. Sure.
Sure. That was completely us.
Oh, by the way, Steam Sage, thank you for the raid. We really appreciate that. I think that's our first raid on LAWhammer. Y'all are just in time. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the
timing.
Magladroth, me again. Do Gork and or Mork have their own demons? I'll
tackle this with a very simple question of that is in and of itself an entire topic, exactly what Mork and Gork are and how they work. Broadly speaking, and I'm saying broadly, the answer is no, but I think we need to drill into this. So let us, between the pair of us, have a chat about as to when to put that up as a potential subject for the future.
That's Sage. Okay, that's Sage.
Is that Sage? Oh, yes. Hi, Sage.
I didn't recognize the name, but I recognized the profile picture.
Nice to see you, Sage.
Yes.
If you don't know, Sage is one of the players in LAWhammer, and she absolutely kicks ass with her character. It's superb.
She does. Go follow her on Twitch. Hawk did a shout out, so if you're watching on Twitch, go over there.
Superb.
Anyway, CEO Necromancy. When it comes to Gork, I'll put it this way. Like Andy said, the answer is like not really, kind of, sort of, but at the same time, what are rogue idols? CEO Necromancy, back to elves and chaos episodes. Now orcs. If I were a dwarf, I'd be upset.
And CEO of Necromancy, you'd be right to be upset, but there is a certain amount of from our side, selection that you have. You're the ones that are choosing the subjects. We put up some, and occasionally we very much skew it to one side or another side. So at one point we just gave elf gods because we wanted to make sure we had a chat about some elf gods, but at other points we will almost certainly just skew heavily to dwarfs. But today is not that day. Today is the crushing of dwarfs with our orcs.
Yeah, to be fair, like the last 2 or 3 weeks-ish, y'all have not done what we thought you were going to do by like a country mile.
Which is great.
Yeah, which is great.
Yeah,
it's great.
Which I love.
Not our fault.
Yeah.
Not that a dwarf would care whose fault it is. They're going to blame who they're going to blame. Magladroth, small bribe for someone to play Gelt or Archon. We'll discuss it. No promises. Laughing God, Dark Deeds, like and subscribe to get. Yeah, supposedly they're starting to send out emails that those are going out soon.
Yeah.
I need to check mine because I don't think I've seen mine yet. But supposedly those are starting to go out. Sidgemeister, if you could add any 40k orc thing to the fantasy orcs, what would it be? Also, Black Crag really sounds like the orc struggling with Karak Flag. The way it's pronounced.
we will get to its name.
Yeah. As far as like 40k, I don't know if there's really anything I would really port over, because it's important for them to have differences, and to be fair, their differences aren't that extreme as you may think. There's a lot of strong similarities between the two. The only thing I would probably port over is maybe like the Squiggoth. It's a really fun big dinosaur monster that, even though it's called a squig, it doesn't look anything like a squig. But it's a really fun monster, and it would basically just be like a giant stegodon type thing with orcs all over it, which would be fun. But that's probably the only thing I would really reach for.
Yeah, on my side, broadly similar. They've already ported over quite a lot of the 40k-esque version of the orcs into Warhammer. And I do mean a lot. But equally, a lot of what is the 40k orcs were ported over from the fantasy side. Loosely speaking, they were originally exactly the same thing. And they have diverged a bit. A lot less than a lot of people realise. Because as 40k has changed what their orcs are, Warhammer orcs have kind of followed suit. So you'll find that there's not a lot I would pour over at all. I'm quite happy with them as they currently exist. They've got their own discrete, unique feel, while simultaneously feel like Games Workshop's orcs, whether it's spelled with a C or a K. So I'm broadly happy with it.
Sean Saltz, which faction are you most interested in playing in the Total War Warhammer, Andy, in co-op play? Do the Wood Elves ever deal with the raid from Black Crag?
Wow, Wood Elves are pretty far from Black Crag.
Yeah, they're a good way from there. Well, we'll talk about that. There's something there that we'll talk about, because there's a very particular thing about Black Crag that I'm very excited to talk about later, which we'll get into something similar to that. But yeah, Andy, I guess he's asking, is there anything you're very interested in going for your first war experience?
I just love, I know this is going to sound really twee, but I kind of love Warhammer, and all of the factions have different things that appeal to me about them. I love writing about them all, I love playing them all, so any of them just make me smile for different reasons. I'm not one of those people who goes, oh, I hate that faction, oh, that one doesn't interest me very much. I'll admit I don't like playing the game of actual Warhammer with some factions over others, and there's some that I enjoy playing more because of my play style, but when it comes to Total War, I don't really have a play style, so I can't really say that I have any favorites at all. But you might find that after a year or so of doing this, I'll go, yeah, I really like playing this type of army, but that'll be more because of how they play rather than because of the faction that they themselves represent.
And that's what is making what factions we're going to play absolute fucking agony. Thank you for the question.
Yep.
Aaron, do you call your Black Crag?
Oh, Aaron, really? Yes.
True. Yes. Yeah. Black orcs come tumbling out of it every once in a while. Yeah. Moving on. So, Andy, intro. We're caught up. Intro.
Okay, so let us begin. Black Crag, Carrick Draz. This is, for me, quite a fun one, and for relatively personal reasons. I would like to take you all the way back to the early 90s. Now, in the early 90s, a very young Andy decided that he was going to open his own shop and his own games club to play not just Games Workshop games, but pretty much everything else that I could get my hands on as well. And I was pretty young at this point, so imagine a 16-year-old Andy getting in contact with Games Workshop's trade and saying, "Hi, I'm a 16-year-old. I'm about to open my own club. I want to shop in it. Let's do business." Yeah, that's obviously an unexpected call from their side. In fact, I was called for a good year Andy the fucking Mad Scotsman from Thurso, because I was this mad kid who was super excited about Warhammer and all the things that I could buy. And I did it. I got my own shop. I did a bit games club, had about 100 members. We were gathering every week. And a part of that, a massive part of that, was Warhammer. And Warhammer, the battle game in particular, was huge at my club. It had just released its 4th edition of the game. It had moved from being the old 3rd edition book into the 4th edition box set with the High Elves and the Goblins. And to support that, the very first set of army lists, Empire first, then the High Elves, then the Orcs and Goblins, were, let's say, slightly popular. The Goblin army in particular, very popular, because they got the new army list. And I wanted to support this. And I remember all the way back then, so we're talking, this will be early 1993, flicking through the Orc and Goblin army list and finding out for the first time about the good old Black Crag. And the story given there is a story that will stand for a long time. But I'm also going to add that this is a story that is pretty much indicative of what Games Workshop does with its setting. So be prepared for me to say, this is the story, but. And it's a pretty big but, perhaps calling on the Black Crag. So, I read through this, and Carrick Draz was presented as, in the Orc version, a fort that was taken by the Orcs and the Goblins all the way back approximately 3,000 years before what would become the end of the world, the end times. And it fell during what would much later be called the Time of Woes, when everything's really, really going wrong for the dwarves. During the middle of the Goblin Wars, as they were called then, and pretty much get repeated through as the Goblin Wars all the way through to the latest edition. And I remember reading this going, yeah, I quite like this, because there was a triumvirate of orc fortresses, pardon me, not orc fortresses, dwarf holds that fell in very fast succession. And I was like, yep, I like this. We've got Carrick Asgol going down, Carrick Eight Peaks, and Carrick Draz in super short, super fast time. And this sounds exciting and interesting. So I thought, I'm going to support the Orcs and Goblins at my club by running a fantasy roleplay scenario about this. Because who doesn't want who doesn't want to do that? Because I had a bunch of fantasy role players, which I was one of, who weren't playing the battle game because they considered it to be a newfangled horror show, because they didn't like what the 4th edition was doing to the battle game, to the roleplay game, because they were rewriting the setting entirely. And they were wholesale. The Orcs and Goblins completely changed what Orcs and Goblins were. There'd been a long period of change through the 3rd edition of Warhammer, where they'd gone from Tolkien Orcs and Goblins into Games Workshop Orcs and Goblins. And the 4th edition army list consolidated this. And there was a lot of hate, and I do mean hate, for what the Orcs and Goblins have become. These big 40k-esque wah style Orcs and Goblins just weren't popular amongst much of the fan base. So I thought I was going to do something to try and counteract this. But I didn't want to do it until the dwarf army list came out. Fortunately, it came out just a couple of months after that. And it did the same to the Orcs and to the dwarves that the Orcs and Goblin army list did to the Orcs. Changed dwarves completely. Dwarves up to this point were spellcasters. They cast magic. They no longer... Yeah, quite. They no longer could. They now instead had runes. And they used runes instead of magic to do everything. Their great dwarf holds were given their first proper... deep introductions, one of them being Carrick Draz. And the story of what happened down there was pretty much consolidated between these two army lists. And the story is really simple. The story is that an orc, get this, are you ready? Named Dork.
Yeah.
An orc named Dork.
Not to be confused.
Warlord Dork.
Yeah, Warlord Dork, not to be confused with the Shaman Dork, who features prominently in a Black Library novel about the vampire counts.
Yeah, completely different. So Warlord Dork is having a good massive wah around down there, and he completely takes Carrick Asgol in relatively short order and goes on a treasure hunt and finds, to be blunt, fuck all. And is really disappointed by this. So he was like, let's get out of here, and marches on Black Crag. And this is something that's worth making clear right from the outset. Carrick Draz means Black Crag. The Orcs do not rename it. There is no, the Orcs took over and it becomes Black Crag. No, it just means Black Crag. In they come, Warlord Dork, and you're like, so what's Dork going to do? Warlord Dork approaches Carrick Draz and completely annihilates it in short order. And that might make you go, wait, he takes a dwarf hold. So how big's this hold? It's the biggest hold in the south that's still standing. It's freaking enormous. And he takes it, not in decades, not in centuries. He takes it over the course of what appears to be just maybe a number of years, possibly even months. It is an extraordinary victory. And he goes, yep, I like this place, and settles in. And that is the fall of Carrick Draz. And as it says there, and it got renamed Black Crag.
Yeah,
I mean,
funny enough, this is one of the times where I actually think Total War to the rescue at times, because Total War added for those that haven't played Greenskins on a minute, they added a landmark building in it, Black Crag, which is called Dork's Rock, which has a picture of Dork getting on his little throne there. And honestly, that to me seems a much more realistic name that the Greenskins would probably call it, is Dork's Rock.
I kind of agree. Black Crag is a poor name for it, particularly from the Greenskins' perspective, because they're literally just using the dwarf name. It hasn't changed at all. And that, I think, was a bit of a shame in terms of the naming at the time. But I was pretty cool with this. The whole story was great. So what I did was I spun a Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay adventure about this. It was pretty simple. It was designed just for basically selling the Orcs and the Goblins and the Dwarves to all of the Fantasy Roleplayers so they could see what the new changes were. So we got to see the Greenskins dwarves in their new greenskin form, and they were terrifying. Warlord Dork took part in that scenario. He was the final part where all the dwarves that were running away from the recent sieges pretty much got minced. And it was super popular. I played it like 4 or 5 times, but from this, good old Warlord Dork stuck in my mind. Now, out there, you might be going, that's a bit of a dorky name, isn't it? Back then, it wasn't. Because in the UK, the word dork did not have the connotations that it has today. Because we had not been so influenced by all the Americanisms that had come in terms of our language. And TV was influencing, but the internet didn't exist at this point. And dork didn't really mean anything to us. But this was going to change over the course of time. So I have a relatively soft spot for this entire location. Then we shift forward in time to the next time when this is properly detailed. And we're looking at November time in the year 2000. At this point, I hadn't just worked for Games Workshop once. I was on my second stint with Games Workshop, having been headhunted to come back to them. And I was working there and the army list came out. So imagine this. Andy's sitting in his office downstairs with a large Imperial Eagle that I painted on the wall because I was that guy. Anyone coming into my office, big Imperial Eagle behind me. Oh yeah. So there I was leafing through it and going, is Warlord Dork still in there? Now you might go, well, of course he's going to still be in there because Games Workshop don't change these things. For those of you who've been watching us for a while, you know that Games Workshop often change things. And by this time, I've been role-playing and playing the battle games for years and years, and I knew that Games Workshop was somewhat prone. So I very carefully went through, and Warlord Dork was still there, doing exactly the same things and at about exactly the same dates, approximately 3,000 years earlier. I was pretty frickin' pleased. So let's fast forward again. The Dwarf Army list, that comes out, I'm going to say this is 5th edition. So that's going to be all the way about 2006, followed by the next edition's army list. We're now moving into 7th edition in 2006. I was now working on the role-playing game. So, and the role-playing game was where I was doing most of my work for Games Workshop. I was also doing some bits and bobs for Black Library, and I was overall having the time of my life writing away stuff. My eldest kid was only 2 years old, and this is where LAWhammer comes from. Told you I was going to mention it, because at this point I just got back into Warhammer big style, because my eldest daughter had just reached a point where she was thinking about doing bits and bobs, and I was like, oh, she's getting older, I might do stuff. I say getting older, she's literally a toddler at this point. She was doomed. She was going to be doing this whether she wanted to or not. And I was playing a lot of fantasy roleplay, and I was like, I'm going to be buying every book just so that I can keep up to date with it. And it came out, and Warlord Dork was still there. I was delighted. Let's fast forward again, this time to 2011. We're now at 8th edition because 7th edition had its 2006 intro a little bit, but it didn't get a Dwarf Army list. It's not until 8th edition we get another Orc and Goblin Army list, and the feats of Dork are mentioned, but he is not named specifically. It's just, there was a warlord, he took this place, you're done. And then, here comes travesty. The year 2014. At this point, it's 3rd edition for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and I am not having anything to do with that because definitely not my game. So I'm basically just running games at home. I'm playing the battle game a lot at this point. And the army list comes out, and I'm like, I wonder if they've updated Dork. And they did. Dork was gone.
No!
Dork was gone. But not only gone, replaced. In the 8th edition Dwarf Army list, they rewrite Warlord Dork's story. And instead, it's Zogbad the Destroyer. Zogbad the Destroyer takes Karakazgul and is then chased out of Karakazgul by a dragon. This is a new story added by the Dwarf Army list. It had never been there before, and I remember reading it going, where's my dork? I will admit, that's not necessarily something that someone should be shouting a lot, but I was pretty upset at the time. I remember going, but I love Dork. I've been using Dork in the background of my games for ages as a nice little story. He's gone, driven out by a dragon. He then goes and veers over to Karak Draz, and then he sacks it in the year like 469 before the formation of the Empire. The story is completely changed. And this is a fine example of what Games Workshop does as they bring out new books. And as we discussed with our Old World stream back in the day, which was a wee while ago, and we never really finished discussing the newer books that came out for that. We might do that at some point. But when the Old World came out, it took lots of established facts and it went, you know what, we're changing it. And some of them stick, some of them don't. And this change, as far as I'm concerned, can get to, if you're Scottish, you know exactly what I'm about to say, it can get to fuck. Because Warlord Dork deserves his moment in the sun. So, having said that, the change is in the 8th edition and the most recent edition. So if, for example, we were to be commissioned to write a book about it, we would have to talk about Zogbad the Destroyer. But possibly, because of the very nature of what I like to do whenever I write, we would look at somewhere like Carrick Draz and we would say, we can make this work together with Dork. Because who wants to lose their Dork?
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is, but that's very interesting to me because Creative Assembly got approval very recently, like within the last 2 years, to call it Dork's Rock. There's no mention of this. They go back to Dork.
So, yeah, and there's a reason that this happens. And I think that this is a perfect time for us to very short discussion about how Games Workshop creates stuff. Yeah. Because this is a fine example of what often happens. We get ourselves a story that's established in the lore, and a new writer comes along, and they're not given all of the previous stuff. They're just told, this is your job, go write this thing. And some writers just write it without referencing anything. Some writers are diligent and go and research everything and try to make sure that everything they write matches what came before. But because Games Workshop has such a long and storied history, it's very easy to miss stuff. And this is an example where I'm going to suggest that stuff has been missed twice. The first time it was missed was when Warlord Dork was renamed, but I'm going to guess that it wasn't missed. I'm going to guess this happened. Warlord Dork is a stupid, dorky name. And I've got a feeling that whoever wrote the Dwarf Army list read it and went, that's a shit name. I can and I will rewrite it. And did. And it became Zogbad the Destroyer. That's fine. This happens a lot with Warhammer lore, particularly when we've got evolving language, and you'll find that some of the older terms that Games Workshop used to use for things change over time because language changes. In the UK, the word dork now means something. It has legitimate currency as a linguistic element, meaning that if you read the word dork, your first thought is, it's a dorky name, ha 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 ha. So generally, it's only useful for a side thing, not for a main character that's doing something important. But you could drop it in as a side joke, but not for something important. So they clearly, I would guess, went Zogbad the Destroyer. But I'm going to then say Creative Assembly came along, got all their old books, went, oh, it's Dork, isn't it? I literally did not know that Zogbad was even there because they didn't check the Dwarf Army list. And they didn't go into, it's only a couple of mentions. It's in the timeline and it's in, I think it might just be the timeline. I can't remember. I've not read it for a while. It's definitely in the timeline. And just didn't check it. So they went back with the established lore, which is in multiple books. And they went, no, it's clearly Dork. And they made it Dork's Rock, and that's kind of cool. And it's got a cool dorky name, makes me laugh to this day. And I prefer that, because obviously I like it. But if I was writing this today, I would use both of the Orc Warlords, and I would use that to be a discussion about how those places fell so quickly. Because Black Crag falls extremely quickly in a way that doesn't normally make sense for dwarves. Because dwarves normally, well, once they get their feet into a place, they do not let go easily. And they have got an ancient hold here that would have been filled with ancient runes, ancient weapons, all manner of very defensive points that would have taken decades to take down, but it didn't. So we have ourselves perhaps the starting here of a story to discuss how Black Crag actually fell. Whatever the case may be, we have ourselves two different warlords that took it down, with Warlord Dork that took it down over the course of multiple generations of 30 years worth of Warhammer writing, and then right at the end of 2014 we have a Dwarf Army list that goes, yeah, ignore all that, it's slightly different. But we have had other licensors go, yeah, well, I didn't notice this, or I'm ignoring that, and they've just said it was Warlord Dork. And so that brings us up to today.
I want to point out something funny.
Go.
Funny to me is that, so when you're looking at just 8th edition of trying to figure out what was going through the heads of all the various writers, and also one other funny thing I noted. So you get the idea that, okay, yeah, in 469, in both of the army books, they agree that Black Crag goes down. But you are correct in that the timeline does not mention anybody's names. So it's likely Total War guys just looked at the timeline and went, oh, there's nobody's name in here. Let's move on. You have to go into the actual Fallen Hold section and read the segment on Black Crag where it actually states Zogbag the Destroyer, which is the only time he's mentioned in the book. So in the Dwarf book, no less. Not in the Green. He's not even
in the
mentioned
Greenskins book. Yeah.
And then, so there's that. So CA must have gone, oh, well, okay, we'll just use Dork because Dork is who is associated with this. But then, I was just checking a random thing. But something that just made me laugh is I'm looking at the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition book, Tribes and Tribulations, that came out earlier this year, which is about the Greenskins. And they have a note about Karak Draz, or Black Crag. But in this one, it says that Black Crag was conquered in 649 before Stigmar instead of 469. So it was conquered 200 years earlier for some reason.
Typo 649. That's just a typo of the 6.
Oh yeah, you're right. It is a typo. Yeah,
it's a total typo. This is the sort of thing that
496,
editing is supposed to catch.
469 says 649.
Oh, editing's supposed to catch that stuff. Yeah, that's terrible.
Yeah, I need to send them an email because they can fix that. It hasn't even been printed physically yet.
That should definitely be fixed. That's a super easy one to fix. Yeah, 100%. So yeah, there we have another issue. And it's small editing issues like this and poor research, which leads to multiple versions popping up, or sometimes writers just going, no, we're moving on to a new version because what became before Dork is not good. You could even, if you wish, just go and his name was Zogbad Dork or Dork Zogbad. Many orcs have multiple barreled names. Take a look at Wurzag whatever Majiggy, whose full name I can't recall off the top of my head, where he's got himself a pretty long name.
Huge name.
Yeah, exactly. So there'd be no reason that we couldn't combine those two names and make ourselves an orc warlord that did them both. But that brings us up to today. And today, what we have is Black Crag, which is the greatest orc fortress in the World's Edge Mountains. And given that the World's Edge Mountains is a core component of the Greenskin forces of the known world, you might argue that this is the greatest Greenskin fortress in the world, and it might be. And it has gone through multiple hands, multiple different tribes during the 3,000 years that it has been occupied by the orcs. And we arrive at Sotek's favourite orc as we get into the modern era and the end times, where Gorfang Rotgut holds that particular throne. And he, as King Gorbad, is a notoriously powerful orc who has held this area for a very, very long time. And that is something that we will be discussing at length because Gorbad kind of kicks ass.
Yes, but before we do, we're going to get caught up with some super chat stuff, and then I'm going to ramble on about a couple of things that I think are important to discuss about Black Crag before we get to modern age Black Crag. All right, so get caught up with these. Darius Rose, hi. Hello. Do the boars the orcs ride are so large because they are bred that way, or because they're just scary ass species of pig like giant forest hogs or prehistoric pigs like the megalos? I don't know how to pronounce that. Megalochorus? Chorus? Same with wolves. So the giant boars and the which are sometimes referred to as just boars, but they would be larger than the boars you would find in like other parts of the old world. So more accurately, they should be called giant boars. And the giant wolves of the Greenskins, they are natural species. They often are out roaming the wilds, and the Greenskins will kind of run into them and grab them. But there are some tribes that specialize in breeding them. And a place like Black Crag, to turn back to the stream, does have its own animal pens. It does have places where they breed their pigs and other horrifying, nasty creatures that the Greenskins will ride into battle. So the answer is kind of just yes. It's all sorts of different things. They are a naturally large and aggressive species, but the Greenskins in a lot of places do also breed them to be as big and nasty as possible. Because something we're going to talk about a lot in this stream is that Greenskins are not just dumb, goofy hooligan raiders. They do actually have cultures, and which may seem obvious, but a lot of people miss that. And they do have things that they get up to that we tend to think is civilization, like animal husbandry is something Greenskins do, especially in Black Crag. There are wolf pens, there are boar pens, there are the Greenskins go out of their way to lure and breed wyverns in the peaks. There are squid farms down in the depths. Well, they're busy. Greenskins are very busy.
Yeah, just to conclude on that one, always when it looks to Warhammer, take everything that's happened in the real world and then just, as we've said multiple times, dial it up to 11. So every species that's in the real world is kind of in the Warhammer world somewhere, and it's generally bigger somewhere. It's generally better somewhere. And if you want to have a justification for that, you can claim that some 10, 12,000 worlds have been steeped in magic, and Old One manipulation has changed many of the original species into something else or adapted them into a new form. So many of these giant wolves or giant boars or giant snakes or giant spiders or whatever may not have initially been in the world, but either through very simple genetic manipulation when it comes to the high-tech origins, or alternatively being manipulated by the massive influx of magic through the world, as they're all filled with Gyron. The Jade Winds of magic has inflated the size of many of the species and changed them into something else. That's also where we get many of the hybrid species, more like the cryptoid species, your Griffins and Pegasus and similar, which were changed either by magic or are quite literally still relatively corrupt and often referred to as chaos species, even though they're entirely, let's say, solid in terms of their breeding practices. They are a species of themselves.
Yep. Benjamin attacks for the true king of Black Crag.
Black Crag.
Yes.
Or Black Crag, as many an American might say.
Yeah, and that is something we will once again talk about quite a bit, is there is a tax system around Black Crag, which also opens up some really big questions. Jack Flanagan, hello, Andy and Sotek. Love this podcast. You consistently show just how much depth and interpretation can be drawn from this fantastic universe.
Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Really appreciated.
Yeah, also totally unrelated, but a Wednesday night stream ranking the Council of 13 would be lots of fun. That's not a bad idea.
That's a pretty good one, actually. I quite like that one.
We can actually do that. Yeah. Darius Rose, Sotek, you mentioned Grimgor might have fought at the Firemouth potentially. Wondering if Urk Ironskull was the leader and almost destroyed the Ogre Kingdoms. You think he was scarier than Grimgor, or a Lubu Grimgor Donhua situation? So, yes, that's a potential theory I talked about a bit. And when it comes to a Wa, right? A lot of the time, what you kind of end up having is a bit of an interesting situation of who takes over in a situation like that, like who's the war boss in charge. And Grimgor in particular is a very interesting character because he doesn't give a shit about leading. He just cares about fighting. He just goes and fights where he wills. And it's kind of under a thing of trying to... Grimgor makes for a fun exercise because it's the idea that you have this very obviously ancient Greenskin, that there are some heavy hints that he's really, really ancient. And yet, how has nobody heard about him until like 10 years ago? And the idea that I think tends to work the best is that he doesn't care about leading. He has no interest in it. He just happens to in the most recent 10 years because he's just the biggest, baddest thing walking around. Everyone's following him. And he's finally arrived where things are getting really amped up for the end times. Whereas if you're looking over at like the Battle of the Firemouth was so colossal in scale that the ogres as a species pretty much emptied out into the area around the Firemouth, and they were outnumbered by how many greenskins there were. So it's very easy to... Because remember, a Wa isn't just one orc leading everybody necessarily. Yeah. It's a massive horde of tribes, and theoretically, there is a Wa Grimgor that was running around in the midst of Wa Ironskull. And it's just that Grimgor ended up not dying in the fight and not going toe-to-toe with Grease's Goldtooth because he was off doing something else. So the answer is, do I think he was scarier than Grimgor? I doubt it, but Ironskull was clearly genuinely trying to lead the Greenskins. He was genuinely singling out Grease's Goldtooth and trying to cut off the head of the ogre's leadership because he wanted to win the battle. Whereas I think Grimgor, you could argue, was just out fighting somewhere, because Grimgor hilariously doesn't actually win that many battles, like big overall battles. Like he himself kicks the crap out of everyone he personally fights, but he actually loses a lot of the major battles because his army will get the shit kicked out of it, and he'll be the only one left, and then he just kind of wanders off, which is interesting.
Yeah, yes to all that.
Laughing God, is there anything in Warhammer Fantasy akin to the Beast of Rises series where it demonstrates what the Greenskins can become if allowed to grow? Yes, go read the Sigmar Heldenhammer trilogy. And read about the Black Orc war boss that Sigmar faced off with. He was a bitch. Like he was the end of civilization in the old world if Sigmar had not killed him. Really good bad guy. Really good bad guy. But like some other good examples, the one that I can't remember his name. The one that Karl Franz killed was another pretty bad one.
Oh, isn't it? Oh.
Yeah,
that's going to really annoy me now. Thanks for that.
I can't. It's on the tip of my brain. Black something. Vorbad Ironjaw. There we go.
Vorbad Ironjaw.
Yeah, Vorbad was pretty bad. But like, I would say, granted, I haven't read The Beast Arises, but if the goal for The Beast Arises is like the biggest, baddest thing possible, I would say probably that first one was really bad that Sigmar fought. Because like the dwarves could not stop him.
Yeah, I'd also say, generally speaking, that the greenskins can become allowed to grow angle in Warhammer is not really the same, because we have had thousands of years of occupation of various parts of the Warhammer world by greenskins where they have been left to dominate, and the allowed to grow has already occurred. That has happened in the Warhammer side of things. So it hasn't got quite the same connotation as it might do, for example, in the other side. But broadly speaking, yeah, there's a lot of scary orcs out there.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that, oh, well, that's what Grimgor is. I mean, Grimgor is fucking huge.
Yeah, totally. In fact, if we just talk about Gorfang Rotgut himself is said to be the size of an ogre. Although the miniature in no way encapsulates that.
Never is.
But he pops out to kick in trolls. He's meant to be about 10 foot, 11 foot tall as an orc, and that is not necessarily unexpected for massive warlords. Most of the big orc warlords that have been kicking around leading any of the larger WAs are not orc size. They're not sitting at your 7 foot tall bundles of muscle. Most of them are around about 10 to 11 foot tall. They're proper huge. So yeah, orcs get big in Warhammer.
Yeah, and if you're talking about like the beast in the sense of like you're dealing with an orc that's someone in chat, Farseer in chat saying like, oh, he's like 33 feet tall. Warhammer Fantasy tends to try and keep itself relatively grounded. It doesn't always, but it tries to. Yeah, and having a greenskin that big running around you'd have to open up a lot of cans of worms to deal with it. But generally, the way I suggest is that, frankly, the Warhammer Fantasy world is very dangerous. And for a greenskin to get to that size would require probably longer than the Warhammer Fantasy world has been around. Like it'd probably take longer than 10,000 years. I don't know how long the beast was around, but with 40K, you have a lot more time to work with as opposed to fantasy. And fantasy also, if something got that big, like you would think, oh, we would have heard of it, but that's not to say Games Workshop might not come out of left field and be like, oh, look, a greenskin the size of Godzilla attacked Nippon. There it is. But until we see that, the biggest ones we have tend to be roughly ogre to troll sized, which is still fucking huge.
Fucking huge.
Yeah. Alfred, is there a book except Queek with a more detailed story about Gorfang and Morglum's alliance? Big neck snapper fan, but there isn't much lore about them. So Morglum Neck Snapper is a really unfortunate character in that he kind of got replaced by Grimgor Ironhide.
Yep.
And once he got replaced, Games Workshop was like, okay, he just doesn't exist. He still exists because he has that really cool quote when he kicked the shit out of the king before Lewin's dad. When he beat Lewin's dad, or that might have been the king before Lewin's dad, actually. Morglum's been around for a while. But where he's like, oh, tell it the king to east is green and all that. But other than that, Morglum, he just got replaced. That's the easiest way I can put it, is that he was Grimgor before Grimgor, and Grimgor Games Workshop decided they liked him more.
Yep. That's pretty much it. Yeah, hit the nail on the head. This is as a general point, this is something that Games Workshop does relatively frequently through the course of its history with Warhammer. They start off with a bunch of characters that they add to the game. Then a new writer comes along and adds new characters that they like, and they often are surprisingly similar to something that came before, but they tweak it and they change, or they add a difference that means that the next writer that comes along goes, that's the one I'm going to take, and completely overwrites what may have been used beforehand with the original set. So you tend to find that characters peak and drop off, and we end up with a different mixture of characters with each edition of the game. And it means that sometimes some characters are just dropped completely, and it sucks if you were a fan of that particular character. Like Justice for Dork.
Yeah. Yeah. That being said, at least Morgan didn't get like retconned out of existence.
Nope,
he still
he's not
exists.
gone. Yeah.
Yeah, he's mentioned in the 8th edition book as just being a big bad, I think he's a black orc, if memory serves, out east. They don't really specify where east is, but he's east somewhere of the World's Edge Mountains. He's like out in the Darklands. But
Darklands.
he does make a cameo in the end times, but he just gets killed by Grimgor. So
Oh, we'll have something to say about that regarding good old what's-his-face as well.
yeah.
Gorfang Rotgut.
Yep, Cinchmeister. Total Warhammer 1 excuse/story of Grimgor traveling down south to Blackheart to kick Gorfang's teeth in because he heard he was talking shit was pretty funny. That was one of the most hilarious, even though it personally upset me very much because I was really sad Gorfang just got relegated to that. But it made for a really kick-ass intro battle in Warhammer 1. I will say I'm glad it's no longer the case because it was a ridiculous, unnecessary story. I still don't understand why they did that all these years later. It would have been made so much more sense to just keep Grimgor up at Red Eye Mountain, but whatever. I'm much happier with the current situation.
It's so far away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little bit like, I'm up in Antarctica. I mean, I'm up in the Arctic. I'm going to come down and kick people in the middle of Africa. Why?
Yeah, it is very funny to think that Grimgor heard of Gorfang talking shit from like a continent away. Went down there to personally kick the crap out of him.
Yeah, very amusing.
Yeah. Laughing God. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean big in turn. Oh, in size, but it's sophistication society. Gorbad. Gorbad is your smart orc. Gorbad was not like, oh, it's a clever beast. No, Gorbad was fucking smart. Deviously so. He was he was an absolute beatstick. He was by no means like easy to fight. He wasn't smaller than other orcs. He was huge, but he was a genuine genius. Unfortunately, he's one of those characters that really deserved a Black Library novel to himself, if not like a trilogy, but he didn't get one. But if you're looking for just the smart Greenskin character, then you get Skarsnik. Skarsnik is genuinely a polyglot, and can read and write, and is often frustrated by how stupid other Greenskins are, and has built a society and is a fucking menace. And the Greenskin we're going to talk about, Gorfang Rotgut, is very intelligent. When Greenskins live long enough, a lot of them tend to become pretty deep thinkers with time. Even though Games Workshop, whenever you read their books, they always treat it like it's some bizarre freak thing that's never happened before. But every single time you get every single time you get a Greenskin that's lived for like at least 60 years, they start being like, oh, they're thinking. And the book will always be like, oh, thinking, that's so weird. And it's like, all right, we've seen this like 1,000 times.
Yeah, just in general, if you want to look at the orcs and the goblins in Warhammer in comparison to 40k, imagine that they are pretty much held off at about snakebite level of technology and a little bit before. And that it's almost like there's some sort of, let's call it field or magic in Warhammer that stops the orcs and the goblins becoming everything they could be. It's like they're held in a state of almost primitive lifestyle. And they never really get to the 40k-esque technology, here we go across the universe. Let's build field technology because we can. They are effectively almost identical to 40k orcs other than that though. So it's like they've been stymied at a very simple technological level and can't really go any further. So in terms of their sophistication in society, what we have in Warhammer is pretty much as far as they get, which is broadly tribal groups that gather together during Great Wars and then split apart again. And often, if they are led by an orc or a goblin, a greenskin, who has any intelligence, they start taking advantage of the surrounding area in ways that you might not expect. They don't just raid like lunatics. They are generally taxing, they are generally making deals, they're making alliances, they are a surprisingly advanced civilization in terms of how they're often portrayed when you look at just the very simple text of this is what greenskins do. They are like this great tide that washes over the world and destroys everything in its path until you take out whoever happens to be leading that particular horde. So yeah, they are more complicated than you might first think, but they don't have the same top tier civilization. I'm saying top tiers in technological civilization that you get in 40k.
Yeah, I will say, Laughing God, I'm reading the chat, so you don't need to super chat if you're like, oh no, I meant like this thing that takes me more text than I have to say. Like I'm looking, so if you want to like explain exactly what you're asking, if we're not quite getting it, I'll keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, thanks, by the way. Super appreciate it. Not that we don't appreciate that second super chat,
we appreciate that.
Yay! But yes, absolutely.
Okay, so he said, I meant that if the Greenskins were allowed to progress at all, could they become a more advanced threat? Yes.
I'm going to argue no. Because we have had greenskins in certain parts of the Warhammer world with multiple generations of greenskins, and they do not advance further than the tech level that they have, and they continue to have. They look like, if you want to be really harsh, and if you wanted to be a writer trying to make sense of this, they are curtailed. They are not the same as 40k orcs. They're just different. They never reach the point where they get technologically advanced. Even when they get access to technology from other species, which happens again and again and again and again. They take orc holds. Do they take their cannons? No. They avoid them. They don't study them. They don't look at them. If they did, they would have had black powder weapons for thousands of years because of the dwarfs. Because there's been cannons kicking around in their various holes for ages. They abandon them. The orcs are, either by character, culture, or by magic or something similar, they're gods perhaps, culturally stymied. There is something that holds them back, and that is arguably their orkiness, if you wish. There is a whole host of different examples for rationalizations for that you could take, but I think it's fair to say that in this example, they do not advance, at least technologically, in the same way that other species in the Warhammer world absolutely do.
Yeah, I agree. There are individual exceptions that make that open up interest, like Ruglug's armored orcs that are a thing, which are greenskins that use black powder. Or you have there's, I can't remember his name, but there's a goblin warlord who was really nasty because he started capturing dwarf war machines and using them, which made him a fucking nightmare until they eventually killed him. And you have like Skarsnik and Gorfang are very different and seem to advance. And I will note that you could, if you want to run with an interesting storyline, talk about that the Chaos Dwarfs, the world was irrevocably changed when the Chaos Dwarfs created the Black Orcs, because when the Black Orc Rebellion happened and the Black Orcs went out everywhere, they took Orc Smiths with them because the Chaos Dwarfs forced the Greenskins to learn how to smith. And that literally caused such an upheaval that the old world was almost annihilated by this new breed of orc that was smarter. But that also took the Chaos Dwarfs quite literally editing them at like a genetic level to be capable of it. So there's a story there.
There's definitely a story, and the untold story of the Greenskins is that as a species, they do not technologically advance. Individuals, as we've said in multiple streams in the past, in Warhammer, for everything where we say categorically, this never happens, there is an example where it does. Every single time. Because there's always someone who comes along and says, oh, you know that thing that you said you can never do? Here's the one that can. He's awesome. Oh, he's been killed, and they're back to the way they are last week, as the orcs are no longer capable of using black powder. But there is clearly something stopping them from doing this. And if you wish that to be a cultural reason, a religious reason, or perhaps just purely a magical reason because there's something that stops orcs advancing, or perhaps in their genetics, perhaps they have got one of their genes edited out of them by the old ones. That means that they never do what the orcs in 40k do, which is they just start making tech. They don't know how it works. They just bash it together because, red ones go faster, and out come all the war machines. If they were that, the Warhammer world would have been conquered by orcs a long time ago.
Yeah, and it's a weird thing. So you have like snotling pump wagons, which is like, oh, the snotlings at a genetic level, when they're together and they're scrapped, they'll build these wacky machines that work. Yeah. And you go, what? And it's like, I'm not explaining myself. I told you what happened. Moving on. So
totally. So the orcs at a genetic level still have some parts of what they do. They still know how to forge. They still know how to make weapons. They still do all of this. Communities build up, and they're often not related to any previous one. They have literally no one coming along and saying, this is how you forge, lads. The orcs come out and they're bashing away, making their big crude weapons. So they're still very much like 40k orcs, but they just stop. There's a technological stop where they no longer pass by.
Yep. Anywho, carrying on with these.
It's an interesting thing. Yeah,
totally. It's genuinely interesting. We could spend hours on that.
Yeah, totally. It's fascinating.
Do major Greenskin holds coexist with other races like pig barter, or is that not possible in the latest canon? I'm glad you asked that. We're going to talk about that a lot with Black Crag. Because we're going to talk about it a lot with Black Crag, I'm going to put it simple and say, contrary to what you may believe, Greenskins can coexist with other races.
Oh, yeah.
They 100% canonically can. We will talk about that a lot here in just a hot minute. So just stay tuned. Watchdog, have the Orcs ever pulled a War of the Beasts and sent an emissary to call for the Empire's surrender or face complete annihilation? I would say, generally speaking, no, because the fight is the point.
Yeah.
However, when you are dealing with individuals like Skarsnik and Gorfang, sometimes something like this does happen.
Yeah. I just completely agree. You've got yourself two different situations. Situation number one, a Wa. This is when you're becoming a tide that's going to sweep over the world. And when a Wa is on the move, there is no call for the end to that war. The whole point of it is that great war that moves, and they're not going to be sending out emissaries. The second situation is a grounded base. So, for example, an Orc fortress like Carrick Draz. Black Crag has an Orc warlord that sits in the heart of it, and that Orc warlord administers to the surrounding domain. And that means sometimes they're going to be going to war with other places, and other times they're going to be building up the resources, or they're going to be doing some other thing. And that means that things like emissaries will indeed occur. They are much more technologically and societally sophisticated than many people realize, while simultaneously being oddly curbed in a variety of places. So the answer is yes.
Yep. Charles K. Laughing God might admit one of the beast things is the idea that orcs have inherent knowledge locked in their brain, machines and such, and with the love wall they can build impossible marvels. Yeah, that is a thing in fantasy, but it works differently. Like a rogue idol of Gork and Mork, or a rogue idol of Mork, is literally that. It is a construct that is powered by Wa energy, that when things are going, the Greenskins will just kind of naturally be inclined to make them.
Yeah,
and then they start moving.
I think the easy way to imagine it is if you were playing a 40k strategy game and you were playing the Orcs and the Orcs and the Gretchen, if you were playing the Greenskins, and you had the entire tech tree sitting in front of you, you start at the beginning, you build up, you get your bases, you get all your extra weapons, you get all your extra bits and bobs. The Warhammer equivalent only has the first square on the tech tree. That's it. They are basically the same, but they only have the first square. So they can build all the basic weapons that get them going, and then they kind of stop. Where in 40k, they just have so much more extra tech tree sitting inside their genes. Where in Warhammer, they're not only not in their genes, apparently, but they also choose, unless it's an individual, they choose not to try and progress their own tech tree, because that's not how orcs and goblins work. They don't go out and learn stuff and adapt, generally speaking. They just know stuff and they do stuff because they are creatures of instinct, creatures that have clearly been created for a purpose. And the Warhammer ones have a very, 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 very small tech tree.
What I'm almost inclined to say, take this with a grain of salt, but I'm very inclined to say it, is that you can almost think of it as the Greenskins Warhammer Fantasy have brutally intense ADHD that prevents them from learning anything meaningful because they can just get distracted directly into fighting again. With the rare exception of like Black Orcs, who had it literally edited out of them, and it made them very dangerous.
Yeah, totally.
Darius, a regular Gore, Orc, and Marauder enter a bar together without weapons in Edinburgh. Do they beat the shit out of everyone in the bar? I think they would kill everyone in the bar, probably. Yeah,
I mean, Warhammer, yeah. I as much as the old Scottish pride wants to rise up, yeah, everyone's dead. It's like, not good.
You didn't even pick, like, the regular man-sized things. You picked an Orc, a Gore, and a Marauder. That would be horrible.
It would be bad.
Rugleg is crossbows. You're right.
There you go, crossbows. And crossbows have been long a part of the Orc traditional weaponry, right the way back to 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So they've often been there, although they largely got replaced by our boys in general.
The only black powder greenskins outside of that one goblin, the only black powder greenskins are the freaky mind controlled ones from Orc Slayer.
Orc Slayer.
Barnack, how to make orcs interesting in the RPG. It's more than barbarians just bashing, unable to interact with player for any different way than fighting. Stay tuned for just a second. We're about to really get into it.
I've also, if you want to see an example of that, when I mentioned earlier that I used to play with my family, the reason that LAWhammer popped up, I didn't actually discuss it in my intro for reasons I've now forget.
Yeah, you were gonna.
But basically, my family were playing Warhammer all the time, so we started a blog discussing our adventures with getting back into Warhammer at Fantasy Battle again, and we called it LAWhammer. So that was it. It's not very big, it's not very clever. But back on that blog, there's a post about building an Orc warband. And that Orc warband is specifically designed for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and communicating with and working with potential PC groups. So there is an ancient blog post somewhere which you can go find. If you just tap in LAWhammer, you'll get my own blog somewhere. It's over on Blogger. And you'll find that post up there, an Orc warband. And so they can be much more interesting because Orcs are a complicated group.
Yeah, and although there are some aspects of the book that are problematic, so you have to be really careful using the book. The Tribes and Tribulation book from 4th Ed does actually have a good amount of stuff that talks about greenskins outside of just as, I'm going to fight them scenarios. There's also a minor story that's not in this book called, I think it's called like between an orc and a hard place or something like that. It's a short adventure that's on their Cubicle 7 or Drive-Through RPG. It's an older story that I think they adapted to 4th Ed, or they made it for 4th Ed. I forget which one. But it's between something and a hard place, and it has a whole thing about an orc warlord or tribe leader, whatever. The advised way to deal with it is not violence, because if you try and fight your way out of that scenario, you're going to get your shit rocked. You're supposed to deal with it in other ways. Yes, between Skarak and a hard place. Thank you. Yeah, because Skarak is the character you're mostly dealing with. Avani, isn't technological stagnation not a general state for Warhammer Fantasy? Yeah, absolutely, indeed.
It absolutely is. In fact, it's such a theme that I think if you wanted to go out there and justify why that's the case for your individual games, you could very easily do so, because there is a theme in Warhammer where technology itself is somehow stymied and never goes past a particular point, and magic, not just for sensible reasons, completely replaces it. So yeah, I definitely think there is something to that. Avani DK, yeah, totally.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Yeah, because totally. It's something that in a perfect world Games Workshop would address, but they're never going to, because they don't want to think about it that hard. David, have you heard of the up-and-coming Orc WoW led by the Orcius or Crimlo? Well, considering what a late nerd he is, I'm sure it's gonna die and it's strangled in the cradle, so I'm not worried. Commander Bone, question: can greenskins mute over time into a new species? We have various subspecies. We have boglars and such. Wonder how aquatic greenskins would look like. Yes. There are so many different subspecies of greenskins that it's stupid. When they arrive in an environment, they adapt to it.
Or they were always there. There's no real adaptation beyond. Well, no, that's not true. Greenskins do adapt. Of that, it's fair. But we also have different greenskin species. So the goblins are notorious, really, for moving into a new area and adapting to it. Take, for example, our night goblins, our forest goblins, our standard plain goblins with the wolf riders, et al. But we also have some really odd and interesting, unique greenskin species in the Warhammer world that just don't exist out in 40k, like your hobgoblins, your boglars, and similar, that are clearly, again, something
your
different.
Fire kobolds.
Exactly. Oh yeah, can't forget those crazy things. So there are lots of different examples out there. So we have ourselves a big story with greenskins that has never ever been tackled properly by Games Workshop, because they just generally add to the story without explaining how that story has been added to. They just do, and here's another version. Where did they come from? How did they come about? What are greenskins? And they tend to avoid it because there's often been a desire from Games Workshop writers not to say that Warhammer orcs are basically just 40k orcs, because they like each side having its own discrete, unique version of greenskins, because they don't want Warhammer to be just 40k, although that used to be the case. They split it up and they like to keep it discrete, yet simultaneously every writer comes along and just bolts on new bits from 40k each time. And to a degree, that happens to 40k as well, as they move on and bolt on bits that originally came from Warhammer in time. So it's a big, complicated mess that's not really had a proper answer for the origin of species, so to speak, popped on it. But I think we definitely can say that our orcs and our goblins are somehow held back, and that reason can be left to you at the moment.
Yes. All right. So getting back to Black Crag, and then we'll get caught up with more super chats as they come in. First of all, I just want to say y'all are asking some kick-ass questions today.
Yeah, some really good questions. Thank you very much.
So one of the things that's really interesting about Black Crag to deeply consider, so something Andy talked about earlier that I just want to reinforce before we talk more about what it's like today, because that's going to be the main discussion, is what it's like nowadays, is that so Karak Thraz was one of the three big holds in that ballpark, being Karak Thraz, Karak Eight Peaks, and Karasakarak, which is kind of a little further north, but is still in that same general ballpark. But like Andy said, the true trio was Karak Azgal, Karak Eight Peaks, and Karak Thraz, because they formed a line through the western edge of the World's Edge Mountains that made a pretty impenetrable defense, because during the Goblin Wars, they lasted most of that period, which was a long time. Like, it was over 1,000 years, a long war. And they held on until, like Andy said, essentially Dork happened, where this one orc shows up.
Dork.
Who Karak Eight Peaks falls first due to the Skaven being involved. And Karak Eight Peaks collapses, all this bad shit happens, and Kingland Ironhammer and his guys evacuate, and they run up to they go to a couple different holes, but most of them go to Karasakarak. Then I want to say only 100 or 150 years later, Karagazgal falls, and then within the same year-ish, which Karagazgal to Black Crag is not a short walk. That is a long fucking road that takes you all the way up to the Badlands along the western edges, past Karak Eight Peaks, up into Death Pass, where you enter Death Pass by Karak Eight Peaks and you go until you hit Black Crag. And then they took Black Crag, where the Dwarf King there, there were refugees that escaped, but the king dies because he basically leads his army out in a final hold the line so the refugees can get out. And those are the only people that escape. It is a massacre. Dork, for how little information we have on him, or Zogbag if they replace it, which Zogbag sounds, I just don't like that as much. It's a goofy name. Also Greenskin. Greenskins are fun to have goofy names. Dork we don't know a lot about him, but he was a monster. Destroying two dwarf holds that had held out for over 1,000 years against waves upon waves upon waves of goblins and greenskins and night goblins and skaven and trolls. Insane. Absolutely insane for him to just then immediately smash two of them down. But the other thing that's really interesting is that in Black Crag, he stops his wall. Yeah. He just sets up shop because he liked Black Crag so much. There's something about Black Crag, and this is actually talked about a little bit in the 4th edition supplement that I enjoy, is that there has been a very long line of violent, big old Greenskin war bosses who have fought for the title of essentially the king of Black Crag. But when they take over Black Crag, they tend to settle in. Instead of just going, wah, and then running off to go fight, they sit and they rule and they set up shop and they take over this kingdom that rules over a lot of Death Pass and a lot of the mountains. And that's just where they live, which is really weird. If you know anything about Greenskins, you should look at that and go, well, that doesn't make sense. I thought big bad war bosses were supposed to wall all the time and run off and go punch things in the face. But that's not what happens here. I mean, even if you look at Gorbad Ironclaw, who came from Iron Rock, he takes over in that area, but he doesn't take over Black Crag. He leaves. And thus kind of avoids this, I don't want to call it a compulsion because there's likely a logic behind it, but it's really interesting because it's not explained anywhere why we get these so-called squatter kings. They just are. And it's a really fascinating concept.
Indeed. I sort of alluded to this earlier when I said there's basically two states for the warlords. State number one is Wa, where they go off in one. and they wash out in a great tide, and they take more territory. And the second state is hold. And this is not an uncommon situation. There are multiple orc fortresses and held areas where they just haven't moved. And you tend to find that the orc was come out from these areas. It's quite clear that we have ourselves, broadly speaking, a biological imperative. This is how the orcs work. And it's very clearly shown here. They get a strong warlord that holds the center, and then the bickering starts between the various tribes underneath them. One rises up from this, and they either move in and take, or they get so powerful they realize they can't take, or they just move on, they move out, and then we get ourselves a tide that moves out. And this happens frequently. We don't have, I think there's actually something we need to pop here. We don't have just 4 or 5, 10, 20 WAs that happen during the course of history. It says in multiple sources in every edition, there are thousands of WAs. Thousands upon thousands of them. We have great WAs, the ones that significantly move out, where the greatest warlords have managed to drag together most of the various tribes and clans of orcs and goblins together. But we have thousands of WAs, and they all tend to come from sources where they are effectively squatting and they don't move. And very rarely will a established king, for want of a better description, then move to WA. But it also does happen.
That's rude. Let's go.
There we go.
How do WAs go? Do orcs just meet each other? So this is actually an interesting thing of there are thousands and thousands of WAs, but most of them never make it outside of the Badlands or just where the Greenskins are, because they cancel each other out a lot of the time. They'll run into each other and they'll fight one another. They don't care who they fight a lot of the time, as long as they get to fight. It's about keeping that momentum going.
Yeah. Imagine if you can, the core. So this greenskin core, and then it's just waves that are popping out every so many years. And those waves are very likely to hit the next fortress, which also has waves coming out of it. So the WAs hit each other, they struggle for dominance, and sometimes one rises up, and those two tides hit, and a new wave forms from that and goes in a different direction. And these waves are constantly pushing out in all directions, and sometimes they break free and enough follow into the space behind that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So yes, they do sometimes just meet each other. They sometimes conquer each other. They sometimes just, once a great warlord is found and everybody agrees this warlord is so kick-ass, they just join up. They don't even necessarily fight. There'll be constant bickering. I mean, we all know that Greenskins have animosity. They're constantly at each other's throats. But when the great WA builds, they all just go in the direction of that particular warlord. So the answer is yes to your question, and also much more as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting, focusing on Black Crag in particular, and this we can look at like back in Dork's time or just in the modern age with Gorfang Rotgut, so I'm just going to go ahead and zoom forward, is that we have this, the Greenskins is set up, they decide that this place suits their needs, whatever that need may be, and that it's, like Black Crag, like Andy said, is huge. Black Crag is a colossal fucking settlement. It is not just like, oh, it's a fort. It's more, no, it's a mountain that also goes up and down. And it is truly a titanic dwarf hold that the Greenskins have completely and utterly infested, more than any other dwarf hold that I can think of in existence. Of that, even when you deal with the likes of, like, say, Red Eye Mountain or Mount Gumbad, which is not really a dwarf hold, but it had dwarfs in it before, or Ekrund, or Carrick 8 Peaks, a lot of those places, the Greenskins are contested. They're contested by Skaven, or they're contested by other horrible Gribblies that are down in the deep dark and stuff like that. But Black Crag, the Greenskins are king. They have dominated the entirety of that hold. One of the things that we, if you read the Queek Headtaker novels, one of the things that actually talks about is that Clan Moors has been trying to get a presence around Black Crag, because they're trying to make sure the Greenskins from Black Crag don't come over to Carrick 8 Peaks and start causing problems. Queek is only able to get within like several miles of it in his initial fights to what the Skaven hope to make their territory, and it's this like mine that's way far out from Black Crag, out in like the surrounding mountains, much further down Death Pass. Even though in some stories you can see Karragate Peaks from Black Crag and vice versa. If you're up in the peaks, you can see them, and yet the Greenskins have such dominance over that area that it's very unique compared to literally everywhere else in the world, which is what makes it such an iconic fortress.
It's an awesome place, because what we have is a true Greenskin kingdom. And it's easy to forget this, but he is the king who still sits, Gorfang Rotgut in this particular case, who sits upon an ancient dwarf throne. And the only time we get a proper sort of semi-description is at one point when Thorgrim, good old Grudgebear, decides to do an assault to try and reclaim it. Because Thorgrim does that everywhere, doesn't he? Somehow he manages to do this on pretty much every hold and mostly fail. He's not been the most successful. And he's the only one who's managed to fight into the gates. And apparently what he sees on the inside is so deeply blasphemous to everything that he holds to in his core as a dwarf that he swears to never again discuss what he saw, but simultaneously to take that place back because of how awful it has become on the inside. One presumes all the ancient ancestor statues have been refashioned into orc versions with Mork and Gork everywhere, plus various awfulness. But we have ourselves a hold that used to be considered. Let's give a quick description of what Black Crag is. We have ourselves a hold that was founded at the beginning of time, pretty much as far as dwarfs are concerned. We're not talking quite Karragate Peaks and the first two pillars that were put in place by Vilea, but we are. They were founded at the same point. So when time begins, as far as dwarves are concerned, Black Crag is there. And it's one of the oldest, and thus the dwarves, up to the point where they lost, considered themselves bluntly better than everybody else. Because, as we all know, the older you are, the better you are. The older you hold, the better the hold. This is the perfect example of a dwarf hold, as far as most dwarfs are concerned. And it held for thousands of years against everything that was thrown against it until eventually the Goblin Wars came. And by the time it was lost, it was considered one of the core holds in the entirety of the Caracan Core. It's not this is a small hold that was lost. This one could as easily have become the core dwarf hold that exists. It's that big. And that is what the orcs took in almost no time at all. And the story behind that, never told. How the hell they did it, never told. But it was clearly something big. I think it might also be worth saying that perhaps after so many thousands of years of warfare, it had been also severely weakened, but it had still held. And eventually all of the various clans that had gathered there, and this included refugee clans from a whole host of other holds that had recently fallen in the area, they then spill out and go elsewhere because clearly they got kicked in. So to quickly summarize, this is one of the biggest dwarven holds ever built and one of the oldest dwarven holds ever built. It is considered to be a jewel in the dwarf crown, and it has been lost for almost 3,000 years. Do they want it back? It is considered one of the biggest grudges that they have, the fact that they have not managed to reclaim it. It is pretty much the thorn in the side of the dwarfs, the fact that it's just there and it should be theirs and it absolutely isn't. And for all that we go 3,000 years, that's forever it's been lost. That's quite within the written record history where it feels like it was just a few generations ago. It wasn't that long. We can take it back.
I mean, Thorgrim is sitting in Kazakarak and he's got Crag the Grim nearby going, I remember when the dwarves controlled Kalakthras, because he was around when the dwarves controlled it.
Not quite. He's not quite that old. He's about 2000, as I recall, off the top of my head. So he's
I thought he remembered
400 or 500. I think he would remember dwarfs who remembered it, as I recall.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
I think that might be
old as shit, but he's close. He's very close.
Yeah, he's old as shit. But it's literally within the storytelling memory of the dwarfs. This hold that was the pinnacle of what it was to be a dwarf. It's in their memory, it's right there, and the orcs don't just dominate this place, they completely hold it absolutely with not just the actual hold itself, but all of the surrounding territory, which is filled with a variety of fortresses, camps, the equivalent of an orc town, I suppose. They are throughout those mountains. It is absolutely an enormous orc kingdom, and that makes it nigh on impregnable. And they hold that pass with a iron grip, in particular with its most recent king, good old. Well, we're going to be going on to him at some point, aren't we?
Yeah, I actually think it's time to start talking about. So,
Yeah.
Gorfang Rotgut.
Love
God,
Gorfang.
there's a lot to say about. I'm gonna do my best to keep my attention focused on his house, his home, and how he like relates to various aspects about it, as opposed to just making a stream purely about him, because there is so much to talk about him. It's not even funny. But Gorfang Rotgut is the most.
Before we dive in, we should catch our little super chats just so that we don't have a big pause between them, because this is going to be a topic.
Black Crag is what I call my ex from Inverness. I quite liked Inverness.
Inverness is all right. But,
I thought it was very nice. I enjoyed it. Commander Bone, Thorgrim after Black Crag. Get the Doomstones now. Yeah. What Thorgrim? We'll talk about what's actually going on inside Black Crag, because there actually are a couple of Black Library novels that talk about the interior of it. So there's various details we know about it. But he probably saw some horrible shit, because he went deep down into the dungeons. So he saw some pretty terrible things. Giga Golgantes. Can Savage Orcs also be found in Black Crag? Do they not live in fortresses? Generally speaking, Savage Orcs are very much more nomadic than most other Greenskins. They like to roam, and they just kind of hang out in the more arid and humid environments, like further down south, or in the jungles of Lustria, or in the jungles of the east, is where you tend to find them. But it's very rare to see them settle. They tend to keep moving, because they're often, one of the things that's talked about, describes them, is that they often follow different herds of animals around. So like the boar riders, Savage Orcs don't keep pens. They literally just follow the boars on the boar's own natural paths. And then when it comes time to ride them or get to war, they literally just go and grab them and like go catch them. It's this whole thing that ends up getting a bunch of them killed because they're goofy. But they are not in Black Crag, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I agreed. I think the chances of them being there are pretty much nil. These are very much ensconced orcs that dominate this area, not Savage Orcs.
Hammond, is Crag the Grim named after Black Crag? No, though I like how you're spelling almost everything wrong in that.
Yeah.
Darius Rose,
too.
Any stories on the Hobgoblin Khanate that's good reading? How scary is the average Hobgoblin? So the Hobgoblins went from being a force that was talked about a lot to a force that basically got wiped off the face of the earth to very suddenly coming back in force again. Where most of the modern lore about them is from the Tarmakon book, because they get a lot of stuff in the Chaos Dwarf book. And then there's some... that's pretty much it from 8th edition. But but they have been showing up in more recent things. So for instance, like I said, the Tribes and Tribulations book from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition has an entire chapter purely dedicated to Hobgoblins and Hobgoblin characters, and they got art and talks about their culture and their shamans, which that's literally the first time I've ever seen Hobgoblin shamans written about. And they're genuinely interesting. So Games Workshop is clearly very interested in them and is doing things with them again. But as far as like good reading nowadays, finding a copy somewhere of Tarmakon is really the only thing that's modern. There is older stuff if you want to go back. So like the older Chaos Dwarf books, there's an old, I can't remember if it's a Black Library book or a White Dwarf magazine, but there's an old story that talks about the original Great Khan who supposedly died of old age, which is noted to be the only Greenskin we've ever heard about that died of old age, ever, period. I triple checked when I did a video talking about Greenskin ages. He is the only Greenskin I've ever found mention of that died of old age, and even then it's a legend. So unfortunately, the answer is not a lot. Good reading wise, pretty much just Tarmakon. How scary are Hobgoblins? They're very, very nasty because they're goblins, but they're much bigger. They're basically man-sized. So a lot of the weaknesses that would prevent a goblin from getting you, a Hobgoblin does not suffer from. and they've got really big teeth, really big, sharp, pointy smiles, really spooky looking. And they are particularly nasty. Like other greenskins tend to avoid them because they are, even by goblin standards, they are supposedly so treacherous that they have evolved their spines and their shoulder plates have a big hump because they evolved that their bones fused together to make them harder to backstab, because backstabbing is so such a thing for them. But they're nasty. They're very nasty.
Yeah, basically all of that. The hobgoblins have been a part of Warhammer pretty much since the beginning, because hobgoblins themselves are one of those classic fantasy tropes, ported over from D&D and similar. And as we move from the 3rd edition of Warhammer, the hobgoblins, which were effectively ported as a small mercenary force that you could add on to any others, with the hobgoblin Khanate established all the way back then, have been discussed down through the editions. They got added back in as a potential trope with the Chaos Dwarf army list in 5th edition, which was a collection of White Dwarf articles that were pulled together, and that's when they got their big huge humps from the art that was put together for that by that was Mark Gibbons. So the big huge humps and the big spines that set out their spines from there. So they're pretty goddamn awesome, and they are pretty goddamn scary. So yeah, there's not a lot written about them though, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, Henry Harm, Fall of Karak-Thras is referenced in Deep Rock Galactic. And so Deep Rock Galactic dwarfs are what happened to dwarfs post end times. That's hilarious. I did not know that. That's actually a really fun reference.
Wow.
Good to see Karak-Thras is out there.
Yeah.
Being remembered all the way in space against space bugs. All right, so Gorfang Rotgut, the Squatter King of Black, the Troll Eater, the Red Fang King. So Gorfang Rotgut is hilariously, despite the fact he hasn't been playable in a really long time, he is by far the most examined of the orc characters. There is a ton of lore on Gorbat.
It's actually crazy. Just to interrupt, just because before he goes off and explains all the lore, this is in fact how crazily badly greenskins are often handled. He is without doubt one of the most detailed characters they have, and they have a crappy miniature from the 4th edition, and then he's pretty much ignored from that point onwards as more lore is piled on, and he gets bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of his overall capabilities. Yet somehow he's just not part of the game. It's just crazy.
Yeah, so Gorfang Rotgut, as far as we don't know exactly when he takes over at Black Crag, but it was somewhere in I think it was 50 or 60 years ago ish. It was a while ago.
Yeah, at least, because in several of the sources, in the latest iteration, he is described as being really quite old for an orc. So old, in fact, that several pretenders keep on coming up and challenging him for one reason or another to say, you're getting beyond it, we can do better. There's a couple of relatively famous stories concerning him where he deals with various, let's say, others. I'll leave Sotek to go into any details that he feels are important, but various others who try to take him down. So he is, by the time we hit the end times, a very old orc. Although when we hit the end times, we have a bit of conflict with him as well.
Yeah, I actually did a lot of research on him for the video I did about Greenskin ages, and Gorfang is confirmed to be centuries old. He's well into his multiple hundreds, which is fucking ancient.
Well, I don't mind knowing the source for that, if you can recall, because I don't recall him being sold. That's brilliant.
Yeah, so he gets a canonical age in the Thorgrim novella, which is from the end of 7th edition, pre-8th edition.
Yep,
by David Geimer. Yeah, that book gives his age as being he's many centuries. He's old. Yeah, they even say many centuries. He's ancient.
That's good, because I couldn't recall that detail. And that's also a really good answer to one of the previous questions, which is what happens when orcs are given time? And the answer is nothing. They do not have the same genetic predisposition to start building tech, to start building giant ships filled with field devices, to start going warg and building a whole variety of vehicles. Oh, yeah. That's not what Warhammer orcs are. They are stuck at a particular technological level with only one square in their tech tree.
Well, it's honestly, it seems like it legit takes them borderline centuries to get to the size of your Gorfang Rotguts and your Grimgor Ironhides and your Morgul Necksnappers.
Really big for an orc.
They're huge. They're huge, but it takes a long time for them to get that big. Anyway, so Gorfang Rotgut the first time we actually get to see him is, I'm just double checking my dates. So the first time we get to see him is about 2470, which is a while ago.
That's like 50, 60 years before the end of the world.
Yeah, that's the first time he really shows up, and he's already king of Black Crag by then. He shows up when Belagar Ironhammer leads an army down alongside Thorgrim and a bunch of other dwarfs to get his foothold in Carrag 8 Peaks. And Gorfang meets them out on the battlefield and fights them. And that's where Gorfang has his big epic fight with them, where he loses his eye. So he only has one eye, and one of his eyes gets taken out by Belagar's cousin, whose name I cannot suddenly remember. Duragar. So Duragar manages to pulp one of his eyes with a hammer, and it forces Gorfang to fall back. But even then, Gorfang was already fucking gigantic, and the dwarfs knew him and knew he was a problem. But he takes over Black Crag somewhere in that ballpark, so somewhere between 50 to 75 years ago. And he has ruled there ever since. And Gorfang is a very interesting orc because he's smart. There's a really, really awesome Black Library short story called The King of Black Crag that is purely about him, and it gives a lot of insight into him as a character, and quite frankly shows that he's genuinely very intelligent. He thinks very carefully. And one of the things about him that I absolutely love is that Gorfang, when he the dwarves call him the Squatter King because they're really irritated about the fact that he just hides up in Black Crag all the time, which makes him really difficult to get to.
Seriously, for dwarves, I mean, pot kettle.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, he's a squatter. It's like, guys, been there for like.
And also, seriously, that's how you conduct warfare, Mr. Dwarf.
Yeah. How dare they use our spells against us? Yeah. So the thing that's really interesting with him is that while he goes out and he kicks ass around Black Crag itself, he rules. Gorfang spends a significant amount of his time being king, issuing orders, spying on various affairs going on, keeping an eye on what's going on with that weird goblin down in Carrag 8 Peaks, sending spies to spy on Skarsnik.
And emissaries as well.
Yeah, and emissaries, keeping track of what the Skaven are up to. Like when Gorfang meets Queek, Gorfang knows who he is. He already immediately knows who he is the moment they see each other. He's informed. He genuinely knows what's going on. He tracks the movements of the dwarfs. He responds to various messages. But
I think there's a small point worth noting there as well concerning Queek. This is important because Queek is not old.
Oh yeah, Queek's only like 4 years old.
Exactly.
At that point.
And, which shows that the information that he has is recent, is good, and is also correct. So yeah, it's not just a matter of he has access to, he knows some Skavener about. He knows who Queek is. And given just how young Queek is and the number of, let's say, feats that he has done in that time, it is really impressive knowledge.
Yeah, so the biggest thing with Gorfang is that Gorfang, this is really key because this completely changes everything you may think you know about greenskins. Gorfang likes gold. Gorfang likes treasure, he likes money, and he understands the value of gold because he uses it. He doesn't just collect it and hoard it and just like lay on it like Scrooge McDuck and just enjoy it for the sake of enjoying it. No, he spends it on things. And one of the things that Gorfang canonically does that's fascinating is Gorfang protects humans and other races that journey through his lands in caravans so long as they pay his taxes. He will protect them, and he will not attack them. If a human caravan is like doing the one of the roads to Grand Cathay, for instance, or to End, if they decide to, now I should know how stupid and dangerous this is, but if they decide they don't want to pay the dwarf taxes, they can go further south to Death Pass instead of the Silver Road, which goes through Carrag 8 Peaks or Karak's lands, and they can pay Gorfang, and he will genuinely enforce their protection as long as they pay him accordingly. And he doesn't just accept gold, he accepts other sorts of gifts.
Slaves.
Yeah, slaves.
He loves his slaves.
Slaves,
and that also
food?
And that is, I think, super fascinating for thinking about this, the actual structure of what this place is like. He deals in slaves, which means he is taking in slaves and using them for the mining operations or whatever else is going on inside Black Crag. And he is, well, at its very least, we have ourselves a population here that's not just greenskins. It's a population that includes slaves from multiple other species. So that in and of itself, again, gives you a different view of how greenskin society can work when it's established, where we generally think of greenskin society as, oh, warg, warg, oh, boys, all right, boss, warg, 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 and that's about it. And they're off kicking something in. We have ourselves a genuine community and society working here that is far more akin to how many people imagine ogres, or in some respects dark elves, running than generally most people think of working with the greenskins. Maybe Skaven, because Skaven also deal with a lot of slaves too.
Yeah. Now, this is just Gorfang before he becomes the legend, because his legendary act takes place about 20 years ago when Gorfang sneaks into Karakazul. Which is really far south. So he leaves Black Crag and goes on this giant journey down. And it's revealed in the Quick Head Taker novel in the very beginning that there is a Skaven by the name of Sleek Sharpwit that either accidentally or deliberately, it's a little unclear, but he basically opens a forgotten underway for Gorfang to take advantage of. But the thing is, Gorfang made his way down and got within Karakazul's area without the dwarfs noticing him because he's stealthy, which once again, fucking terrifying. This is a greenskin who thinks. Yeah, and he's huge. Like, he has no business being stealthy, but he is. And he breaks into this forgotten entrance to Karakazul, and it's ugly. He goes in, a bunch of dwarfs die. He literally crucifies the king's son, Kazrik, on the throne after he shaves him, shaves his beard. And then he does something really interesting, which is that you would think, oh, greenskins, they're just going to kill everyone, loot, and leave. He doesn't loot the place. He takes captives.
Prisoners.
Yeah, he takes King Cazador's wife.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of his friends and a lot of his staff, and he grabs them all and he runs back to Black Crag after leaving this symbol of haha, fuck you on the throne of Cazador's throne. He gets away and he goes back to Black Crag. And the other thing, to frankly just fast forward because I'm so fucking fascinated by it, is that he doesn't kill his prisoners. You would think, oh, he's gonna like horribly torture them and horribly kill them and yada yada. No, Thorgrim rescues them 20 years later. And they're in relatively okay condition.
They're hostages.
Which, like...
yeah.
What?
They're not just simple prisoners. They are hostages. They are being clearly used for a purpose. They're being kept for a purpose, to potentially trade later, to use later, to ensure that other dwarves do not approach lest they be killed. He has got himself legitimate hostages. And this is, again, something that undermines our general view of how greenskins are handled. But it's also interesting. I said this in a stream just yesterday when I was doing a Q&A about random nonsense, that there is a host of weird prisoner exchanges that go on in the variety of stories that we have about the dwarfs and the orcs and the goblins. For example, Ungrim Ironfist at one point takes an entire orc horde and takes them all prisoner. He doesn't kill them.
Yeah.
He takes them prisoner. And this is one of the side stories about concerning ogres, really. But he takes them prisoner. And then there's no explanation as to why. But when you look at the story down here, we suddenly start seeing potential reasons for why. Prisoner exchange. They want people back. They're looking at trying to do something. There is a lot more to the stories between the dwarfs and the orcs than you might initially realize, particularly when you take a look at the king that we have here down in Black Crag, who legit balls has the rule, hates dwarfs. He actually hates them. He despises them for all the fights that he's had alongside them, yet still he is taking prisoners. So we have stories here.
Yeah, which... Fun fact, they never explain or examine.
Never.
Like,
but we have it happening, which means people like us come along and say, well, why? Why? And you start justifying it.
Yeah, one of the things that's super interesting, and it also has this fascinating dichotomy of like, clearly he wanted to deeply spite King Khazor Dragon Slayer, because he not only like mutilates his son, but then kidnaps his family and just keeps them as hostages, which implies a very deep relationship between the two. That is, we never get any explanation of what may have been going on between Khazor and Gorfang. That is their only interaction, is that hostage situation. But there is no further exploration around it as to why Gorfang went to Karak Azul of all places, which is so far away.
So far away. So clearly there's an existing long-term story that's not yet been covered here, because he has a grudge. He's got a dwarf-like grudge that he is laying out on the dwarves. He basically did a commando mission half a continent away to do this and succeeded. So yeah, we've got a story that's yet to be told there.
Yep. And then, of course, this is when he is also he's having regular deals with Skarsnik, where Gorfang, once again, as a very clear thinker, which challenges everything we think we know about orcs, is looking at this goblin named Skarsnik, which I always love because Gorfang always makes these snide comments about he hates Skarsnik's name because it's not a goblin name, it's an orc name. That always bothers him. But he actually treats with Skarsnik. When Skarsnik initially takes over the Eight Peaks in like 2460 or 2450, somewhere in that ballpark, Gorfang goes down and visits him. Gorfang personally shows up and meets with Skarsnik because, frankly, he's probably thinking about killing him. And when the two of them talk, Skarsnik is talking to him and basically is able to convince Gorfang, hey, I'm clever. I'm a good ally to have down here. You and I should work together. We can control the pass instead of just fighting each other. So think about that. You're dealing with two greenskins who meet with each other. They're both kings, and they both want to control everything. They're not like passive. They're very clever thinkers, and they come to an alliance, a treaty of saying we should work together instead of fighting each other. Now, they're constantly spying on one another, and I have zero doubts that they have tried to assassinate each other multiple times through more clandestine means, just to keep each other on their toes. But the fact that you have this working relationship between a species that whenever you read kind of a more general view of them are always, oh no, they wah smash.
Yeah, totally.
Completely flips on its head everything we think we, from a distant understanding, would understand about greenskins. So, oh, they're a destruction race. They don't have a civilization. They don't have a culture. Yeah, they do.
Wrong. Yeah, they do. Yeah, completely agreed. The allegiance, effectively, between Skarsnik over into Black Crag is extraordinarily important as far as I'm concerned, because it speaks to the not just depth of the Greenskin civilization and exactly what it does, but it speaks to its complexity. They do not simply just war with each other. They don't. They have got alliances in place. They have got alliances in place that are born from mutual respect and the understanding that having that other force sitting on their border is to their benefit, not necessarily their detriment. They basically have tribes who choose not to war with each other. And the tribes that are within each one of their provinces choose not to war internally as well. Of course, they're greenskins. They have animosity, as we've said on multiple occasions, but that generally is antagonized and made worse during wars. In this particular instance, we have two large colonies of greenskins, both of which have relatively mutual respect, as much as they may not like to admit it, have come to deals and hold that pass, and that pass brings them individual and significant benefit, whether that is on Rotgut's side. We've got ourselves wealth that is coming from that, wealth that is then used for furthering his kingdom's capabilities, and then inevitably the internal squabbling that happens on both sides that turns into individual was that reach out from their individual holds. It's a fascinating place, just in terms of what it represents to greenskins as a whole, because this is what happens when you get get long-established greenskins in power, with long-established kings in power, you get effectively civilization. And civilization that stands against almost everything that any scholar in, say, the Empire or over in, say, Ulthuan would ever suggest for the greenskins. Their appreciation of what the greenskin species offers is nothing. They have no civilization. They are tribal, basic, horrible monsters, where the truth is behind the scenes that they are much more complex and there's much more going with them. And one could almost argue that given just how grounded and solid this place is, in time, you could eventually end up treating with all manner of unexpected allies and enemies around them in a way that you absolutely would not expect from what is generally perceived to be a greenskin fort.
Yeah, and it's also worth, I think, dialing in on that. What makes Black Crag, in my opinion, so particularly special is that when we talk about a lot of greenskin fortresses and like the more civilized aspects of greenskin culture, it's usually goblins. You know, Carrick 8 Peaks, Goblin Run, Red Eye Mountain, Goblin Run, Ekron's kind of nebulous, but like it's almost always goblins. But Black Crag is always run by an orc.
Orcs.
It is an orc fortress, very uniquely. One of the only ones in the world that's like that. And the other aspect about Gorfang that's really fun. So talking about Carrick 8 Peaks or Black Crag itself, as far as the structure, is that you have this hold that some of the things we know exist in it from the story is that you have Gorfang's throne room, which is the original throne room where he sits up on his big throne that he took from the last Orc war boss, who did it from the last Orc war boss all the way back to Dork, who took it from the Dwarf King. And it's this big, beautiful room that has these giant windows open that let cold air blow in, that also allow you to see all of Death Pass, all the way down to Carrick 8 Peaks. And it talks about how Gorfang is often standing there, like staring out across his land, staring over particularly at 8 Peaks, because he thinks a lot about what Skarsnik is up to be frank, because he realizes there's something going on there. There's a theme that's talked about. This is actually one of the things I think the End Times did actually pretty okay. And granted, it's because it's not actually the End Times. It was the end of 7th edition, start of 8th edition. But there was an End Times plot about the avatar of Gork and Mork. And there's a lot of greenskin shamans trying to bring this about. And Gorfang was convinced by his shaman, Mad Zargak, that he should be the avatar of Gork, and that Skarsnik should be the avatar of Mork. And there's this whole storyline of them trying to convince Gorfang to go through with this. Skarsnik is trying to convince Gorfang to go through with this. Now, spoiler at the end of the story, Gorfang refuses. He actually decides to subvert a prophecy and chooses to go his own way in his own destiny. He ends up dying the way he chooses to die, which once again makes him a very, very interesting character. But we'll get to his death in a little bit. But
which one?
We'll talk about that. But in Black Crag, a lot of some of the things we know exist. We have boar pens, which we talked about, like the various animal pens. They do boar breeding, they do wolf breeding. They have squid caverns down in the depths because Gorfang invites in all other types of greenskins. He's got night goblins, he's got orcs, he has representatives from other tribes. There are notes that he has greenskins visit, even from the likes of Savage Orc tribes, even though they're not around. But tribes are allowed to visit Black Crag, and Gorfang gives them territory to say, your tribe is allowed to hang out here. And if you start going out of your bounds and you start messing with the people around you, almost like a lord divvying out land to like peasants or individuals of, you work for me, you're part of my group, but you stay on this chunk of land. If you start messing too much with the people around you, I'm going to come down there and kill the shit out of you guys. So you better behave. But that's a fascinating thing. He literally divvies out land of the mountains, surrounding territory in the depths, so that he keeps tribes in good greens with them. He treats with ogres. He treats with humans. A huge aspect of Gorfang's story is that he treats with humans, and that humans are allowed to come into his lands. And if granted, once again, animosity. If they're unlucky, they'll run into a group of greenskins that don't do what they're supposed to do, and they'll just kill everyone and take what they want.
Yeah, they certainly will.
if they're on the luckier side, they'll meet the various greenskins that are loyal and follow Gorfang's rules, and will bring them to Gorfang, where he will meet with them and treat and say, this is what you need to pay me in taxes in order to pass through my lands unharmed. You can either do it or I'll kill and eat you. And they go, oh, okay, let's pay the man. And that allows him to have very bizarre exotic things you wouldn't expect. He has bizarre creatures in the depths of Black Crag kept in, I wouldn't call it a zoo, but in like various cages or fighting pits for entertainment, because bred in circuses. One thing Gorfang understands that's really interesting about him, Gorfang understands that greenskins get bored. And if greenskins get bored, they become dangerous to themselves. So Gorfang organizes entertainment for his lads, whether it's fighting pits, whether it's for organizing certain tribes to go against each other, whether it's deliberately moving certain tribes so that they're moved to counter a Skaven expanding the Under Empire so that they get to fight the Skaven, whether it's moving them to deal with a dwarf incursion, whether it's, oh, he gets word from Skarsnik that Belagar and them are up to something, so he'll send some lads out that way, or he goes and attacks these really far-off holds. He is organizing an empire. And Black Crag is the center of this spider web, which once again is just fucking awesome and fascinating to me. Yeah. Like, he runs an economy with like gold and teeth, because not all greenskins treat in gold. A lot of orcs and goblins don't value gold. So he keeps a hoard of teeth because that's a currency greenskins actually do value. But he understands the value of gold and he pays ogres with it. He pays human merchants that come through. He doesn't just be like, oh, give me all your shit and get out, because another thing I love about him is that Gorfang and Black Crag, he doesn't just extort people. He treats with them fairly because he wants them to come back. He wants them to keep coming through his land so he can continue to tax them. He's paid people for rare exotic things from Cathay and End, whether it's like armor or weapons or something that just catches his fancy. He has a kingdom, and it's so weird.
Yeah, I don't just accept all of that. I accept and wholly support all of that. He is a fascinating character, centuries old, truly intelligent in terms of how anyone judges intelligence, capable of controlling, manipulating, and holding the greenskins together underneath his rule. It's worth noting that it is primarily an orc hold. It is orcs that lead and rule here, and they are passing on the messages from their big boss, and they are ruling in a very feudal-esque type fashion. And we have ourselves a host of others around them that you might expect may be more clever, more intelligent, more likely to take over, whether it's, say, Skarsnik and everything that he's got going on, or whether it's the various incursions of black orcs who respond to his various calls for war. And you might think that a big black orc might come along and be able to take over. They're not bigger or cleverer than him. They just aren't. He tends to be faster, more capable, and mentally agile in dealing with what are the genetically superior black orcs. They lose to him again and again and again. He understands that sometimes you need to make a show of proper power. He's getting on a bit. He's many centuries old, but that has also brought wisdom. He understands how to deal with his own species in a way that most orcs do not, which means he also understands the concept of a Wa. He understands the concept of gathering together a large horde and what that requires, where you get an actual set of feats of strength where you are defeating other clan chiefs around you in order to bring them in. But he's willing to ally with others. He'll do out a call, a literal call. Normally, a Wa forms around an orc that goes out and starts going, let's go this way, as the various tribes falling behind them kick in crap as they go. Not him. He will do a call to war and ask everyone to come to him, because he's a different sort of orc. He is a king, and he acts like a king. And for me, it makes such an important point about the depth that the greenskins have that are significantly beyond that tribe that lives in the forest that your PCs or your characters are supposed to go in and kick in for whatever it is that they might be holding because they're causing terror in the local community. It speaks to orcs and goblins, but orcs in particular being much, much more capable than most people realize, and significantly more intelligent, to the point point that the simple black and white writing that we often get for orcs is completely undermined by what he's doing. Orcs can be intelligent. They have reactions to things. They have an entire society and civilization that should be represented when you're working on your Greenskin army lists or writing about Greenskins in your role-playing games. They are sophisticated and not necessarily, using pretty heavy quotations here, evil, or even not necessarily prone to destroying anything in their path. In fact, they are, under some circumstances, completely civilized, very martial, very prone to bickering and shouting and possibly killing, but equally more than capable of letting folks pass by because they've been told to by their king, as they just sit there watching on. This is not the Greenskins that we get from your classic stereotypical quick short story where the Greenskins are nothing more than unthinking brutes that everyone should be terrified of. No, these Greenskins are a fully civilized people in many parts of the, not just old world, but the overall known world. And they interact with, fight with, or ally with all manner of different other species and civilizations around them. So Black Crag, in some respects, is not just a model for what orcs can be elsewhere, as in, this is the unique example. I'm going to go further and say this is possibly the standard that we don't hear about very often. There are multiple orc fortresses all the way up and down, not just the World's Edge Mountains, but across the world. We know that there's massive orc fortresses over in Nagaroth, for example. They're generally said to have been taken over there by the Dark Elves, who enslaved a bunch of orcs, used them in their various fights, and then they got out and did their thing. But it's possible they were over there to begin with. I'm sure they'll come up with a story at some point. But equally, we almost certainly have large orc fortresses with established kings who have established forms of society and civilization across the known world. I would argue that Gorfang Rotgut is not the unique individual that he easily is expressed as by the books. I would suggest that he is more of a standard, because whenever we have a large orc fortress or a large stronghold, we get the classic, oh, except this place where it's actually organized and surprisingly well managed. I don't think it's a unique situation. For all, he is a pretty unique individual.
Yeah, I would say he's the apex of the expression of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that's really interesting is that with him is along with the races that we've talked about him treating, he treats with Skaven. That's another thing. Mm-hmm. He actually deals with them, which once again, very impressive. He's been on his throne for as long as he has, to be dealing with and constantly backstabbing and keeping the Skaven at arm's length. One of the big reasons he allied with Skarsnake is because he was caught literally between Skaven and dwarves constantly harassing him. And Skarsnake offered a much more reliable ally at dealing with the Skaven and really understanding and being able to get at them. And Gorfang deeply appreciates that about Skarsnake. Mm-hmm. But some other really fun things about him from Black Crag. I mean, he has launched assaults on Badakvar, which is like right across the way.
Which
pretty
is
close.
Really far away as well.
Yeah, pretty far. A lot closer than Karakazul, but not by.
That's true.
But it's still a jaunt across the Badlands. One of the other things about Black Crag itself that's good with Gorfang is that not just the animal husbandry, but there's farming in Black Crag. Greenskin farms, of mushroom farms, of the greenskins, of protecting and doing all of the trappings that we associate with this is a building civilization. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I find really interesting, and Andy talked about this a little bit, but I want to kind of dial down on it more. One of the things that's explored a little bit with Gorfang, but I think it could be explored much more and is fun to think about, is that in Greenskin culture, a Wa is almost kind of like a phenomena as opposed to like a deliberate decision a lot of the time, where like a war boss will start kind of like winning fights and then they start to kind of build up momentum and they just don't stop until they die or until they get really defeated. Gorfang, one of the things I really love that we see in the King of Black Crag storyline, if memory serves, is that he thinks about going on Waz. Like, Mad Zardock, his shaman, talks to him about going on Waz, and he resists the urge. He feels it. He feels the bump, the thump in him of like, oh yeah, Gork and Mork want me to fight, but he goes, no, it's not time yet. I could be more prepared. And that is something very uniquely in common between him and Skarsnik. That once again, not just to them, there are other characters out there I think would fall under this, but they're not Grom the Paunch or Gorbad Ironclaw or especially Grimgor. Grimgor is like the exact opposite. Grimgor never resists the urge. He's on a never-ending wall, essentially. Of that, Gorfang and those who have reigned in Black Crag tend to lean towards deliberately holding in that urge and keeping it contained, keeping it bottled up until likely someone kills them or they just can't take it anymore and finally explode out of Black Crag at the head of a massive wall that is going to be really ugly. Gorbad, you could argue Gorbad Ironclaw kind of falls under that, being from Iron Rock, which is very, very close by. Of that, he's an explosive wall that came out of Black Crag, which is why it was so devastating. But what's interesting for Gorfang for me especially is that most of the Greenskin characters that you really get to see through a lot of the novels, the second they get that impulse to wall, they just go. Like they can't help themselves. They're just gonna go. And that's used against them by Dark Elves and Vampires and Skaven and Necromancers. All these other characters will manipulate Greenskins into wawing and running off and going and do things. Gorfang doesn't.
Yeah. And I would use this to reinforce something that we discussed quite a bit earlier in the stream, and that is that orcs do seem to, in fact, let's just say greenskins, do seem to fall into two general states. State number one is base building, and state number two is attacking. And this is really simple. And the attacking form is the Wa, as it moves out in great tides. But they nevertheless have their base builders at the back. They are effectively a perfect example of how to run your classic strategy game if you're playing a PC game. Because they've got their base builders, and then they've got their ones to go out in great Was and attack. They're pretty much perfect at this. But generally speaking, when you're looking at the Warhammer game, they focus on those that are at war. They focus on those that are going out in the Great Was. So that is what the army lists focus on. They focus on the Great Was and the great characters who are at the top of those Was. But when you read between the lines, you realize that they don't just have Great Was. They also have bloody great base builders. And these base builders last far longer than any human equivalent, for example, who generally won't last for more than 30 or 40 years unless they are particularly long-lived, which in the Warhammer world, not that common. These are base builders who can hold in place for sometimes centuries. Centuries of rule, holding together greenskin tribes and making them stronger, tougher, and more capable under their rule before eventually Was spill out from where they are, perhaps led by the local king or led by someone who couldn't defeat the king and then spills out at the edge and builds their own Wa as they move out elsewhere. And eventually perhaps even becomes powerful enough to defeat that king if they ever went home. But by that point, it's a wave. It's a tide that's going in a different direction. So loosely speaking, places like this very much reinforce the idea that orcs are not simply forces of destruction. They are also civilization builders, which makes them great for computer games.
Yeah. Also, it's funny to think about something that Gorfang does that is not explicitly stated, but if you put two and two together, is the idea that Gorfang uses that aspect of greenskins against them to maintain his rule of if there is a particularly concerning rival and tribes that are just getting a little too antsy, he just gives them that nudge to send them on a wall, and it gets all the greenskins that are a little undependable to swarm out after him, and he's once again secure on his throne, and he's used that to great effect.
Yep, completely. I love this, and it's sad to a degree that we've never really had the in-depth, let's say, dive through what makes greenskins work for Warhammer, because it's almost like most of the writers are too shy of the underlying 40k-esque tones of many aspects of what the greenskins become, to the point that they often don't even want to admit the spore thing, whether it's a thing or whether it's not. Is the mushroom connection actually a connection? Is it not? Ooh, and different books...
I will forever salute the Skarsnik book for having the balls to dive in on that.
Skarsnik book was brave, and I strongly appreciated it for its braveness in doing so. But the Greenskins are a deeply complex species. And it is thanks to things like Carrick Draz, what becomes obviously Black Crag, that we can see them for what they are, beyond simply being the greenskin entities at the front of a WA, which, by the way, are obviously terrifying and a clear expression of what it is to be a greenskin. But that is only one facet of it, and it's the facet that understandably Warhammer focuses on, because Warhammer is a war game. That's what you're going to be dealing with. But Warhammer is also a war game that deals with sieges, and that's when we get ourselves a completely different set of stories for our greenskins, not necessarily just taking part in a siege, but also being besieged, because there's a host of fortresses, there's a host of forts and border towers and everything else held by greenskins, and Gorfang Rotgut in particular epitomizes much of that, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah, Iron Rock is one of his outposts. Like, Iron Rock is an orc controlled outpost that guards the approaches to Black Crag. Just some like yeah. Yeah. So this was actually an interesting comment by Hawk I wanted to bring up. Thought there's a Dawi rune in Black Crag that's meant to keep cool heads and is such graceless Squadron Kings with Greenskins. So you could run a storyline of one of the things that's interesting about the Squadron Kings in particular is that, contrary to what you would expect for Greenskins, the crown of Karak Draz has been passed down through all of the Orc Squadron Kings. Gorfang Rotgut wears that crown. Despite the fact that it's been 3,000 years, it hasn't been lost. It has been worn by every orc that has taken it, which is really interesting. You could run a story there. However, I will say that I don't actually think that's the case, because there are other settlements that have the same setup in that there are greenskin civilizations there. Yeah, most notably being like Mount Grimfang and Ekrend are two really good examples of, they have full greenskin civilizations that are hanging out there and they're happy. Like, they don't, like, they're more interested in controlling that space than they are in like spilling out or in like abandoning it. Because you do have times where the greenskins have come in and taken a hold, but then they completely abandon it, which is fascinating. To tie it actually back to Black Crag and the trio of holds that fell, Carrick Asgal was mostly abandoned. Yeah. The greenskins, they went in, they didn't really find anything because the dwarfs actually did a bang up job of sealing all of the vaults and everything, and the greenskins couldn't find them, and they just kind of gave up and left. And then a couple of greenskins hung out there, but not a lot, until Graug the Terrible showed up and just absolutely murdered everybody. But it's a really interesting thing that it's not a guarantee, which once again tells an interesting story of sometimes the greenskins will take over a place and then they just leave. They just piss off. They don't hang on to it.
It does suggest that there's something that they're looking for. Now, if you're going back to old 40k schisms, they're probably looking for a good breeding ground, as in somewhere where they can get their spores down and they can make more orcs. And certain holds will be better for that than others. And it does suggest that Asgal just did not suit their preferences. It just didn't match what they needed as a large group. So they moved elsewhere and they found somewhere that absolutely did. It does change the orcs in that sometimes their WAs are not WAs as we understand them. They're not wholly destructive forces for the sake of destruction. They're almost settling forces, looking for new places to move into. As they've effectively overpopulated the local area, they spill out through WAs, destroy everything in their path, and then settle back up into all the dark places. So there's definitely something that I think should be examined inside our Greenskin source book here to try and resolve all this. Will we dive into our super chat?
Yes, I was just about to say that.
Look at us. Almost thinking in sync.
Almost. Very close. Let's see. Chad Pearson, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chad.
Finally able to catch you guys live. Are there any Black Library books besides the Slayer novels that focus on the dwarfs? Oh, so many.
So many.
if you want, one of my highest recommended ones for dwarf and greenskin readers is The Doom of Dragonback, because it does the best job I've ever seen in a novel of showing what a Wa is like from the other side and showing how fucking terrifying it is. But it's a must-read for dwarf fans, in my opinion. The War of Vengeance trilogy, super awesome. It's dwarves and elves. You also have just the Dwarf Omnibus, which I think nowadays is called or like Stone and Steel or Oaths and Stone or something. But it's got novels by Nick Kime and Gav Thorpe. That includes novels like Oathbearer, which those are really, really good sets of books. There's also...
I'd also add, if you're looking for something that's just speaking to the dwarfs in general, go check out Grudge Lore. Because Grudge Lore basically combines all of the lore about dwarfs and drops it into one Black Library book. That's put together by Gav. I helped a bit in that book too, which was nice.
Yeah, that is part of the... Masters of Stone and Steel. That's what it's called nowadays. So I would pick up that book and check that out. Games Workshop...
Is Grudge Lore in there? Nice.
Yes, Grudge Lore is included.
Sweet. I didn't know that. There you go. Good.
Yeah, it was originally just called Dwarfs when it was a paperback, but they re-released it a little while ago, and it was called Masters of Stone and Steel, I think. I think that's right.
Good.
Or it's just called... Anyway, you can find it.
Doesn't matter. Go find it.
Elemental exposure. What's the teeth to gold exchange rate? I don't know, but that's a genuinely fascinating question, because in Black Crag, there would be an exchange market. Think about that.
I'm not sure they're necessary. Oh no, there would. No, there would because there'd be orcs that raid that would take the gold on purpose, and then they'd want their own currency, which is teeth. So they would almost certainly be doing
an exchange market in Black Crag.
There is.
Which means there's markets in Black Crag.
There is.
Like, there would be smiths, and there would be goblins and orcs selling things, which is really fucking cool.
Yeah.
And also, just the idea of an exchange market is fucking hilarious to me, because there would literally be arguments of that. Imagine that animosity. Like, think about how crazy our markets get, how heated they get, but it's with orcs and goblins who are punching each other and stabbing each other. Of like the gold to teeth exchange rate, you punch an orc and is like, all right, give all the teeth that I knock out of your mouth plus this amount is what I'll give you in exchange for your gold. Nils, how would the Lawmians try to control Gorfang? There would be Lawmians that have visited Gorfang, undeniably. He would have dealt with them, and that's a fascinating story to think about.
See, this is ultimately one of the stories that should be told, because Gorfang is old, which means Gorfang is a known entity, which means that, for example, if you wanted to tell one story, it could be that the Lamians led Gorfang there to pacify it, to take control of the area because it was falling out of control, for example. The Lamians are a deeply manipulative bloodline, and the idea that they are not somehow working in this area is very silly. They would be. This is core to what they do. So would they be working to control him? Control is, I think, a difficult word here, but most certainly influence and direct as and where possible, yes.
Yeah, I would influence, I think, would be the good term of trying to make sure that Gorfang, if you're dealing with a Lamian who's trying to protect the old world, to be frank, one of the things you need to make sure doesn't happen is that you need to make sure Gorfang does not start. Gorfang needs to stay in his hold, because if he comes out and he leads all Black Crag up towards Blackfire Pass, that's going to be bad. That's going to be really fucking bad.
So you're probably going to find that there is at least one pretty old vampire in the local area who is both monitoring and attempting to manipulate the situation, but they're greenskins, which means that it's going to always be relatively difficult. They're going to be working through others. They're going to be generally attempting to push let's say outside greenskin hordes in the direction of them, both to ensure that they become more defensive and to try and stymie the potential of the rise of further was. There's lots of ways that you can manipulate without generally ever directly confronting or talking to another, but most of it's going to be on the outside pushing in, and that's also going to be working with other species or helping other species without them realizing it, getting Skaven into a position where they can perhaps harry at their defenses, which means that again they become more defensive in turn. It's all about manipulating from the outside rather than the inside.
Yeah, but man, like just imagining the Game of Thrones that is Gorfang's court is actually very fun. Of that, like, because like Andy said, you could take this in so many directions. Of have the Lamians ever directly approached him? Maybe, maybe not. Have they ever sent human caravans with very specific items to try and sell to him to influence him in various ways? Maybe, maybe not.
Quite.
Are they manipulating?
They're all stories to be told.
Yeah, there are a lot of things you could do there. Hey,
definitely. Thanks very much.
Ricky Chapman. I could definitely see Gorfang trading with dark elves for exotic goods and creatures in exchange for acquiring dwarf slaves. Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%.
For all Gorfang's little empire looks like it would be focused just on that little circle around him, it's quite likely extends all the way over to the coast in a variety of ways. We know that he raids far, and I mean really far.
His stomping grounds apparently is like Barak Var all the way down to Karak Azul. That is huge.
And while there might be a variety of local tribes and local, let's just say, antagonistic groups, he moves out in force. Enormous chunks of orcs who are militarized. These are well supplied, well armed, dangerous, together orcs. They're not the ravening hordes of a Wa. This is a proper orc force that's going from one place to another in a way that is generally perceived to be deeply unorky by most. This is what black orcs do. Black orcs are the ones that militarize. But you got to remember where black orcs came from. Black orcs came from orcs. And these are the orcs that have... Black orcs are basically, what do you do with an orc to stop the Wa component to a degree? So
how do you rip the animosity away?
Yeah, totally. How can we make them work together? Because, and I think this is the important part, because we've seen it. The Chaos Dwarves have seen it. They know that they can get the best out of these orcs. It's just they're exceedingly unruly, and exceedingly unruly for others to deal with. So they got the Black Orcs to do it on their behalf because the Black Orcs could be controlled. But the Orcs themselves, they deal with that unruly nature in a way that the Chaos Dwarves couldn't. So the Black Orcs aren't needed per se to make Orcs act like this.
Oh yeah, no,
but they are a way. But they are a way to control the orcs. That's all they are. And they made it much, much worse for the Chaos Dwarves, and they kind of done screwed up there. But when we look over here, we can clearly see that orcs can entirely militarize under control by themselves. And these large groups that stomp all over the place, again, do completely suggest that not only would there be potentially fixed and long-term trading deals, that these could have been going on for almost 3,000 years with repeated orc kings over the course of time, making trades with the Dark Elves for slaves that they otherwise would very, very rarely be able to get their hands on.
Yeah, one of the things I actually want to reiterate, just to be clear for anyone watching that doesn't know, Gorfang is not a black orc. He is a regular orc, which makes it all the more exceptional.
Yeah, he's a regular orc who's the size of a freaking troll, but he's nevertheless
he's
a
not
regular orc.
Genetically altered.
And as far as he's concerned, he is literally the biggest orc in the world, because that's what he thinks of himself as. There ain't no one bigger than him.
He's damn close.
And he's probably damn close.
Yeah,
maybe even.
Yeah. To put into perspective how big he is, he faces off with another Black Orc war boss. Gorfang picks him up and pulls a Bane. Like, he picks him up and smashes his spine on his knee because he's just that fucking ridiculous. But I just wanted to pull this up real quick, just a map to kind of exemplify, because I actually enjoy pulling up maps for LAWhammer. But I wanted to just pull up this real quick to show off Gorfang's territory. We're talking about everything.
I've got LAWhammer in corner.
Pardon me, I'm going to get rid of that. We got all of this territory. This isn't even all of it. Like, actually, it goes way further down than this. But like, look at all this. This is Greenskin controlled territory that leads over to the Black Gulf. So trading with Dark Elves and other naval forces would require some effort, but it's very doable. Of just like from Akron to all this stuff of that you could see Iron Rock, which is controlled by and characters and all that, connecting straight over there to the ocean, which is just really interesting.
It's a large area that he claims as his, although do be aware that all of that area is not controlled by him. Most of it isn't. Most of it isn't. It's only the area around the central part of his kingdom that is. But all the rest of it, as far as he's concerned, is his.
Yep. Black Dracula says, Talains and others also hire Greenskin mercenaries. Yes. It's not often brought up. It's one of those things that used to be very present back in 5th edition and 6th edition when Dogs of War were a very regular thing you could do. And then as you got into later editions, Games Workshop just completely got rid of mercenaries as a function. Like, they just deleted it from the face of the earth. And some of that was because they didn't really like how goofy a lot of the Dogs of War was, and other was that they really tried to screw down on like not allowing you to hybridize your ranges. Probably for financial reasons. They wanted you to buy each individual range. But
and there was a certain amount of game balance as well. Because if you had yourself a core army, that a quarter of it could be all the bits that supplemented the weaknesses in your army from another one. It meant that your individual armies became less, let's say, unique. Greenskins have got a lot of weaknesses as a force in Warhammer. If you then supplement it by just taking in all the allies that patch up those holes, it meant that tournament play was much less this is a Dark Elf army, this is an Orc army. Instead, it was a Dark Elf and Orc and Chaos and whatever else, just to get the best out of it. So I can understand why it happened, but it did mean that the background in particular pretty much forgot all of that. Not necessarily great.
Yeah, that being said, they have brought it back in the old world. Mercenaries are back and awesome in the old world again. But yeah, absolutely. Chileans hiring Greenskins has happened. And it's out there. Yeah, there's actually even notable stories about various forces in like the Empire finding ways to bribe or convince orcs to go after someone else and not them. It's not as like Gorfang would be relatively easier to treat with. He's much more calm and level-headed than most Greenskins by a country mile. But there is a notable through line in Warhammer of that there are. You can treat with Greenskins. It just takes a significant amount of luck and fortunate circumstances, but it is possible.
Yeah, I'll go even further there and say that not only can you treat with Greenskins and potentially hire them, they also hire. There's multiple examples, and I do mean multiple, where Greenskins are hiring in mercenaries and other forces to supplement their own forces, which means by extension, they are working and living together in a way that we don't generally think about, because you're just like, oh, we've got ourselves some ogres that have joined the Greenskins. To choose the obvious option, like Gorfang and his Marauders or whatever. And then they come, but they are working and living together. There's camaraderie in the most unlikely situations where orcs are speaking with these other things. They are communicating. And whilst, yes, there might be that camp there and this camp there, sometimes that's not the case. Greenskins are much more in depth than many realize.
Well, I mean, they coexist with giants and trolls. Giants trolls are not Greenskins. A lot of people think they sometimes are because they're in the army list. They're not. They're completely separate species, but they live in and among the Greenskins.
And
very well.
Whilst it's fair to say many of them are basically enslaved, particularly the giants, they are not always. And there's several examples of stories where they're not enslaved and they are instead there for drink, or they are there for some other reason, and they are effectively allies. So it's a complicated situation.
There's actually a really funny Total War loading screen quote you can get about giants, where there's an orc war boss who says something along the lines of like, well, he drinks all the booze and he eats a lot of the goblins from time to time, but he's right good in a proper scrap. So yeah, we like having him around because he just follows them around, which is really interesting. Vanderbone, okay, I'd now like Gorfang to be in Total War of Warhammer 3 with a fun Black Crag management mechanic where he gets taken tribes and unlocks. Oh yeah, absolutely. I have been campaigning for Gorfang since Warhammer 1. I've been on that train.
I completely agree. Gorfang Rotgut is quite literally the best in terms of a good example of a character for a game like Total War. He pretty much is the epitome of how orcs could express in a slightly different game mechanic, and definitely worth including.
Yeah, especially because he would be the one orc character that you could really delve into unique diplomacy mechanics, and it would be really fun.
Yeah, totally.
Sarmillion Bloodweaver. Could Wang make an old orc young again? So, sort of. Here's what I'll say. Gorfang is many centuries old. He is so old that he should be falling apart. But in the Thorgrim novel, when he's really getting back out and fighting again, he starts getting into it. And he starts like kind of limbering up and getting going once he's actually out fighting and is finally taking the war to Carrick 8 Peaks. He starts kind of getting going real good again. And his age does not slow him down in the slightest. So would I go so far as to say it makes him young again? I don't know if I'd say that. There is something you could argue that Wa energy could do something like that. It could rejuvenate an older orc. I wouldn't, if someone said that to me, I'd go, okay. I'd like to see that written somewhere, but because I haven't, but I wouldn't blink if I saw that. Yeah,
what I would say is it doesn't make him young again. It makes him strong. And fighting makes orcs strong. But having said that, though, sitting on your ass apparently also is not necessarily a bad thing for some orcs, and that's something that the rules, particularly in something like the fantasy battle roleplay game, pardon me, should somehow reflect, showing you can get your king orc and exactly how that works and how they develop. Because the general rule of thumb is the more they fight, the bigger they get, and that doesn't really matter for how old they may or may not be. And if they stop, that process stops, and apparently they can die of old age at some point. And as this one here, the warging, it's not so much the warging that makes them young again, it's getting into all the fight and the wag energy that comes along with it.
Yeah, there's kind of a funny thing about Gorfang, that the Rotgut is actually his most recent new title. Last name, normally he's like, oh, it's Gorfang, or Gorfang of the Red Fang tribe, or Gorfang Troll. He was known as Troll Eater for the longest time. He's called Rotgut nowadays because he got himself a belly. Because he eats good and he eats a lot, but he's not obese, and it didn't slow him down. If anything, he's gotten nastier. But
agreed.
Watchdog. Do you think the winds of magic had an effect on the orcs, not that suffuses them, but leads them in certain directions, like a musk or something along those lines?
So, broadly speaking, probably not. There's little that we can say for certain regarding wag energy and exactly how it manifests. We know that it can be treated as and used as and also defended against like magic. So as it gets concentrated, and shamans can then throw it out in one fashion or another, others who use magic can stop it. So it's by itself magic, and when orcs get together and begin to wag, that generates massively. So I would generally suggest that no is the answer, because wag magic seems to push it away and make it separate to them. So unlike other species, which almost certainly are strongly influenced by the winds of magic, I would gently suggest, although it might not be the case depending on what gets written at a later date, that it's not necessarily directly related to the winds of magic. But
I'm going to be contrary.
This will. I was about to say, but to make my last point, when we move towards the end times, they try to wrap the orcs up directly into the existing winds of magic as they currently stand, and then move into Age of Sigmar with it. But everything up to that set of books, which also, by the way, completely mints Gorfang's general setup, up to that set of books is very indicative that it's different. But the end times decides, no, it's the same.
So the thing that I'll say as kind of a counter proposal is that I think there is a relationship between magic and war energy. In the Storm of Magic book, which we got in late 7th edition, early 8th edition,
8th.
was the Greenskins do have a notable ability to interact with storms of magic, in that they end one, which is fascinating. And they also take advantage of several. If you go watch our Grom stream, we talked about Old Blacktooth, but granted, there are other forces at play with Old Blacktooth. But there's like a really notable story about how there was a big storm of magic that got unleashed in a big Lizardman city when a bunch of demons came pouring out of a portal that collapsed, and a bunch of Savage Orcs show up and just kill everybody, and they end up sealing and ending the storm of magic through using the power of Wa, which is weird but cool.
And indeed is sort of where I was gently leaning, in that it appears to be a little more antithetical to the winds of magic than it was the opposite. I agree with the word relationship. I think works really nicely, because they are not dissimilar. The magic is magic, and it is Wa magic that they use, but it appears to be broadly antithetical to the other types of magic, rather than being one of those magics. But again, to be very, very blunt, this gets completely undermined with later versions, especially as we move into
Age of Sigmar Greenskins are a whole different beast. Literally. They're something totally different. Still loading. That being said, the old world did not keep that thread going, because the old world made Wa magic something completely different. So Age of Sigmar Greenskins are just different, which is fun.
Yeah.
Still loading. Hi, gents. Could Wa energy power machinery? Could it? Probably. Has it? Not I mean, not that I'm aware of, unless you think Snotling pump wagons are powered by WoW energy, which I could see the argument for.
Yeah, I would generally say their tech tree is again stuck at one space. So whilst the opportunity is definitely there, and we could 40k this up like mad, something stops that from happening in Warhammer. So as it currently stands, the answer is probably not really no.
Baron von Bastard. Hello, sirs. That is a profile picture. Are there any characters
hell?
Are there any characters that if orcs hear about it will drop everything to fight? It depends on the orc, but generally speaking, if there's like a big notable, like, usually if it's someone that sounds fancy and important, greenskins will really want a chance to get a kick at it, like a dwarf king or the emperor. Like dwarves or greenskins are often drawn to big names because it's flashy and it catches their attention.
Yeah, agreed completely. Generally speaking, greenskins go for trying to take out the biggest thing to prove their worth. Just keep it nice and simple. That's generally what they do. But then we start speaking about individuals. And individuals, just like any individual, can get their own grudges, get their own issues. Take, for example, good old Rotgut. He hates dwarfs. He despises dwarfs. So there are going to be certain dwarfs that are going to make him go, you know what? We're taking this one down, because they hear it and they're like, no, if he's coming through my lands, dude's gone. That's it. Dead. And out they go. So generally speaking, what Sotek says is spot on. And that is as simple as, is it big and nasty? They're going for it. It doesn't need to be a particular name. More specifically, though, every orc has got his own predilection. So it's not all orcs will hear this name, they're off to it. But one individual orc will have certain names they'll always chase.
Yep. Krimgelto is the Tooth Fairy and Orc in Warhammer. You know, you joke, but if I were allowed to write something stupid, they were like, just something dumb you can have fun with, would I make a creature that exists in the orc mythology that is an orc version of a Tooth Fairy? I absolutely would.
It would be hard not to.
A creature that steals orc teeth, from their perspective, that would possibly be very terrifying.
Stealing their wealth.
Yeah, I'm like, that'd be awful.
Yeah, totally. I definitely, I mean, you could make a really good Spirit of Gur that was drawn to the discarded teeth. A Spirit of Gur would absolutely be stealing off with that sort of thing. So I think you could make a really fun little
like
box text.
Little spikes of Gur.
Spike,
yeah,
exactly.
That'd be great.
And orcs that don't look after their teeth have their teeth spirited away by these spikes of Gur. You definitely make that work.
That would be hilarious, actually. That would fit the setting very, very well.
Yeah, I like that one.
Sounds like Black Crag, and what Gorfang is doing exactly what I was wondering about. I knew that it was a clever getting at sadistic streak. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I still, one of the things they added later in his story that I really love is that Gorfang is such a spiteful asshole that when he took Cazador's son and tortured him, he carves a glyph in his forehead that in Orcish means something along the lines of gift, which is like, what a dick. Like, what an absolute dick, leaving him for his father like that. Yeah, Gorfang's great. Phil, with both Gorbad and Scarsnake in the way, how do the dwarfs of Karakazul manage to have any sort of regular contact with the rest of Karazhan Corps? Haha, they don't. There's also no other friendly hold south of them as far as I wear, which makes their position very precarious. Does the state of affairs make things hard for affect them? Yeah, Karakazul is a dour place. It is really dour. It's under attack a lot of the time, and there's a reason that it's got some really big badass characters, which is the only reason it's still around. Being Cazador and Thoric Ironbrow.
Yep. Basically, yes. Yeah.
The Iron Hold
it's tough.
Yeah, it's one of the most isolated holds. They're surrounded by baddies. It's a bad time.
Yep.
Which is more dangerous, a freshly formed orc or a freshly formed Saurus? Well, I'll put it this way for you. A freshly formed Saurus is a full adult that knows everything he needs to know, climbing out of the equivalent of a swimming pool, ready to kick your ass and eat you alive. A orc newly spawned, according to the Scarsnake novel, which is the only source we have on this, but I love it, they spawn out as runts, which are notably smaller and will grow very quickly with time. So a newly formed Saurus would probably be way worse
Yeah, I agree completely. Go check, if you want to get an idea of how orcs work, go check the original Gorka Morka game. Gorka Morka has got a little scientific section in the back. This was a game set in 40k where it explains how orcs go through their entire process. It was based upon the older WAG, the orc books that used to be out before that. And it's got a really nice breakdown of how they come out, and they're skinnier, runtier versions of what orcs are. And when they get into fights with each other, that builds up the muscle mass as they move from being effectively the equivalent of teenage orc into full orc warrior after a little bit of beating up with each other. So that's loosely the situation with the orcs, meaning that lizardmen, when they come out, they're good to go. You could easily make an argument, though, that one of the reasons that the orcs are on the Warhammer world is because the requirement from the orc DNA was used to create the lizardmen as we understand them now. They were used to effectively program, to program the lizardmen as to what they are using orc DNA. That would not surprise me at all. It would make a very obvious step and also explain the similarities between the pair of them, because we know that the lizardmen are entirely fabricated in their current form. They used an existing species that was on the Warhammer world already, which, according to some sources, had their own cities. But they turned them into the, let's say, warrior horrors that were to come. Yeah. So the answer is simply, the Saurus are going to kick ass from the very moment they're out.
Destroy to create. Hammond, we summoned thee, show thyself. He was here earlier. He was talking about how he was talking about his ex-girlfriend from Inverness. Morning to Crescent. Gorfang hates dwarfs, but he's smart enough to understand slayers, and if so, is he cool enough to leave them alive? I would say yes.
I would say yes, and I think that he wouldn't leave them alive in the sense that you'd expect, as in allow them to go off and do more stuff. He'd be far more likely to just imprison them and leave them alive in a prison, incapable of doing anything, and then taunt them. He seems to be very much that sort of vindictive, hateful orc, where he's leaving them alive, he's feeding them, he's letting them effectively be stuck in pacifism for potentially decades in his dungeons. Definitely leave them effectively going mad down there in the dungeons. Very much a him. It also wouldn't surprise me if he literally let some of them loose just to go marauding around to pacify orcs that were causing trouble within his own kingdom, because it's exactly the sort of manipulative bullshit that he'd be up to.
Yeah, one of the things that's I love a lot about Black Crag, I meant to talk about earlier, that I'll just do in a quick tangent here, is that Black Crag, someone was asking earlier about, could there ever be like wood elves attacking Black Crag or something like that? One of the things that's canonical about Black Crag is that for the last 40 years, there have been adventuring parties, last 20 years, there have been adventuring parties who have tried to sneak into Black Crag and save the dwarf hostages. Cazador basically has, I think he's basically said, like, you can get half of his treasury if you bring the hostages back, which is a horrific amount of money. Or it's like the pick of the treasury. I don't remember what it was, but it's some obscene reward that even when Khazor offered it, like, remember, it's to save his wife and like 50 hostages. The other like members of the council that advised the king were like, I don't know if that's a good idea. And Khazor was like, shut your fucking trap. But so tons of adventurers have tried to get into Black Crag and save them, and all have failed. But have there been elves that have tried to go in there? I would bet you a decent adventuring party has probably had their fair share of elves alongside them. And they've all died or been captured or got in there and realized it wasn't possible and had to leave.
I wouldn't like to face him. Holy moly, facing off against Gorfang, no chance. I mean, if you went to Gorfang from the 4th edition of the game, he wasn't that impressive. He was like 90 points, as I recall, because I used him several times in my army. His biggest draw was that he was strength 5, which for an orc was one strength higher than you could possibly have under normal circumstances. And then he had, a couple of magic item slots. You could put him on a big magic monster. Suddenly he became relatively good. But over the course of time from that iteration, he has become effectively an ogre-sized orc who is ancient, wise, capable, and bluntly scary. I would not want to face him at all.
Yeah, no, he would be, that would definitely be, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people know about it, but like, he fought Queek Headtaker, and Queek Headtaker could not hurt him.
Yeah, because he's got this ancient armor, and he's sitting there going, dink, 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 then his sword gets stuck in it, he's like, oh no!
It was dwarf counter! Like,
I know!
Took a weapon designed to penetrate dwarf Grumrow and hit him, and it just got stuck. And Gorfang was like, "Is that it?"
Yep, is that it? And he's literally laughing at him. It's hilarious.
Baronet, is Greenskin...
Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay PC possible? Yeah,
possible.
So all the way back in 2nd edition, there was some sort of plans to make a book about greenskins in the same way that Skaven had a book and the Undead had a book about both using them as PCs and also how to add better NPCs to your games. And as we moved into the 4th edition, I had a planned book for the 3rd phase of the releases that I had planned. The first phase was Enemy Within, the second phase was Path of the Old Ones, and the third phase was The Orders. And there was going to be a greenskin book including how to use greenskins as PCs. There is absolutely no reason that you couldn't do it. They make, much like Skaven, really good PCs, particularly for one-offs, convention games and similar. Do they make necessarily good long-term PCs? Well, it depends entirely on what sort of campaign you're running. You need to have a good story to make them work together well and last long-term in a way that still feels like it's proper greenskins and not we're just doing this for the sake of doing it. So you need some good stories there, but absolutely, they make great characters.
Yeah, and if you really if you want some additional ideas, Age of Sigmar's roleplay system has a dedicated book to every allegiance. So there's a death book, a destruction book, an order book, and a chaos book. That gives a lot of really fun ideas for long campaigns. And you can read those and try and cannibalize some of the ideas to back retrofit into Warhammer Fantasy. It'll take some, it'll definitely take some effort, but you can definitely do it.
Yeah, well worth doing though, because it can make for a super fun campaign. As I said, all the way back in the day, I did a bunch of promotional adventures, which involved being dwarfs and orcs during the time of everybody's favorite orc warlord, Dork.
Yeah, I mean, hell, just thinking of in modern Warhammer, if you were a greenskins caught in the politics between Skarsnik and Gorfang, while also dealing with Belagar Ironhammer being up in the 8 Peaks and trying to get dwarf reinforcements, and Queek Headtaker, because Queek Headtaker full on attacks Black Crag very, very recently, and causes Kara Kazul to attack Black Crag.
Absolutely. And it's not just a great political situation. It's a situation where we've got ourselves orcs that clearly come from multiple different backgrounds. We've got guards, we've got sentries, we've got orcs that are responsible for handling slaves, for dealing with others, for patrol routes. We've got ourselves a wide... Yeah, totally. The exchange rate orc. We've got ourselves a wide array of different orc types that would make for great PCs. You could easily get yourself a bunch of career trees that work around at least 30 or 40 different careers that you could build for your orc characters, all of which completely fit in with Black Crag and make for super fun orc characters. So yes to all of that. Plus if I was running that, I'd also have goblins in there too, because that's just fun.
Oh yeah, definitely. Ricky Chapman, how many arenas for fighting are there in Black Crag? We could see them going full Rome with slaves building water arenas for aquatic battles. I would say that it's probably full of fighting pits of all sorts of different sizes. Black Crag is criminally underexplored, despite the fact that it would make an amazing setting for a regular hardcore dungeon for a traditional Wolfrut party, and it would also make an incredible setting for a all greenskin party. And I would expect there would be all kinds of different fighting pits, some that are kind of haphazardly made and are so not sanctioned, so to speak, where others are big entertaining arenas, where Gorfang uses them for entertainment to fight monsters they've captured or large groups of enemies they've captured, things like that, for the whole bread and circus act, because there would be an intense bread and circus system going on in Black Crag, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would be interested in doing something like this, because this feels, this is a core component of, for example, Tillian culture, which in turn takes strong elements of ogre culture. And parts of that ogre culture almost certainly would have arrived and influenced parts of the orc culture.
I can imagine an ogre overseeing it. There's this big ogre announcer.
I think that would be brilliant. But I'd also want to try and think about what would happen in reality. Rather than just simply going, let's port over something that exists elsewhere, make an orc equivalent, what do orcs do orcs fight.
Yeah, they're all
And
like
even,
pouring down into it.
We are going to get the concept of the pitch invasion would be the standard that would happen in these. So how is this handled? What happens when the orcs all move from going her to arg and coming down? How is this handled? How is this orchestrated? What do they do to make it all work? So there would be a different process. If I was writing this, I would not be interested in simply copy pasting over the idea. I would definitely have something ogre run, because that would be super cool. Okay, yeah. And then the ogres wanting it to be the way the ogres run it, and then the orcs who've got their own thing where it would be very orcified, the goblins who are much more cowardly by nature, who would very much like to watch the orcs and the ogres doing their thing. So they're the natural audience, not the natural participants. You might find that many of the fighting pits per se are mostly goblin arenas, where the orcs view them with a certain amount of disdain. You should be in the fucking pit, not sitting out there watching. There's lots of different ways that you could manipulate it, but a little bit of thought, I've not given it any. I'm just literally throwing stuff at the screen. Would turn it into something super fun.
I love imagining like the scene from Gladiator, where you have that big announcer with the first time that Marcus Aurelius comes to, or not Marcus Aurelius, the main character comes back to Rome after he's a slave, of this ogre being like, Hail Caesar! And it's like Gorfang Rotgut sitting up on his throne eating troll steak.
Yeah, that could be super fun. And I think that you could create something that felt unique and orky here, that didn't feel like you were just copying and pasting from Maximus. Yeah, you weren't just copying and pasting over from Rome or Tilia or the ogres. It would be this lovely new thing that shows a different type of entertainment, and again would show that the orcs have got their own civilization, and their civilization is based around conflict and how they manifest that, control it, and channel it, which means that the leaders are going to be involved with this, and every single part of their society should have this at their core. There's going to be fighting in literally every one of their primary interactions. How is this controlled? How is this patrolled? How does the whole thing not just collapse? How is animosity, which is a core component of being an orc, dealt with by other orcs who understand that this is going to happen? How does this civilization work? And explaining how entertainment works would also explain how they handle their own animosity as well, and I think could show a unique set of circumstances for greenskins in a way that Warhammer would become, in terms of what it does with its greenskins, entirely unique. Because as it stands, their greenskins are already different to other fantasy settings, but this would completely change them into something new, and I think definitely worth an examination.
Yeah. As far as because just being aware of the time, looking at the end of Black
holy
Crag.
Crap.
Yeah, I think
flew by.
Yeah. So I think it's worth talking about the end of Black Crag and kind of what happens to it as the setting wrapped up. Yeah. So Black Crag ultimately, it's interesting. Black Crag met its end in a very weird set of ways, because it was actually mostly through the Black Library novels, and it didn't really get addressed outside of those. So if you follow the, I'll put in parentheses, canon version of events, what essentially happens is that Queek Headtaker's novel happens, and Queek, through shenanigans, to put it bluntly, leads to a situation where he kind of pisses off the Karak-Azul dwarves so much that King Khazad-dûr finally rouses from his angry depression and leads a entire dwarf throng to lay siege to Black Crag. So Khazad-dûr just outright attacks it. He finally loses it, can't take it anymore after everything that happens with Queek, mainly because his son vanishes, and he knows where his son will go. So Khazad-dûr attacks Black Crag. Meanwhile, in the depths of Black Crag, Queek Headtaker gets into a big fight with Gorfang, along with a bunch of other characters. And interestingly, the big fight that's the center of that isn't Queek versus Gorfang, it's Khazric versus Gorfang. They have their big rematch. And one of the things that's very well written about the book is we don't know what actually happens. We basically have the two of them fighting, and it's this big epic showdown, and Gorfang is like genuinely struggling fighting Khazric as essentially a slayer. And Queek ends up
one Seroth.
Yeah, and basically Queek runs away before we get to see the outcome of the fight. but it's implied that Kazric dies. But Gorfang, Gorfang is put in a genuinely interesting position by this, because Karak Azul has done the one thing he probably never thought they would do, which is that they're full on laying siege to him. They're throwing caution, they're throwing essentially the hostages to the wind, and are saying, fuck it, we're balling. And as he's being attacked, Queek Headtaker is disrupting things as well. There are Skaven problems happening now. Scarsnake is busy dealing with Belagar and the Skaven, so he can't come help Gorfang. And Gorfang is suddenly deeply under siege. And this causes Gorfang to realize that he has to do something, because he's essentially losing. Because the dwarves of Karak Azul are coming at him hard. And he is struggling. And so he actually ends up leaving Black Crag. He sneaks out with a big old army and goes to attack Karak 8 Peaks to kill Belagar, kill Thorgrim, kill Queek, and basically declare himself King of Death Pass and bring about the Greenskins version of the end times. But he gets there, shenanigans happen. He fights Belagar and beats him, to be frank. Gorfang just beats the shit out of Belagar.
Totally.
And then he gets shot through the chest with a bolt thrower, survives it after falling down like 3 stories of pure stone, mostly fine, despite having a bolt thrower sticking out of him. And this is when we get the pivotal moment of his character that I love so much about him, which is that he meets Scarstick Shaman, who's been working with Mad Zargak, which is Gorfang's orc shaman. The two of them have been trying to convince Gorfang and Scarsnick to team up, so they become the avatars of Gork and Mork. And this goblin shaman says, hey, Gorfang, you got a bolt sticking out of your chest. You're dying. How about you leave this fight, come with me and the lads, we'll heal you up, and then you and Scarsnick will be mates. And you two can rise up as the avatars of Gork and Mork and take the whole world by storm. And Gorfang genuinely thinks about it for a minute, and he goes, you know what? Nah. Fuck you. No. I'm going to go fight. Because that's the orky thing to do. Fuck you guys. And that he just fucks off. And he runs back, and the goblins are like, all right, see ya. And he runs back upstairs, and he fights Thorgrim Grudgebearer one-on-one. And it is a kick-ass fight. It's a great fight. And Thorgrim kills him. And he decapitates him, and he takes his head. And this is where the 8th edition gets a little funky, because the 8th edition dwarf book comes out after this novel, because that's in the Thorgrim novella. So Gorfang dies, and basically what is implied to happen is that Thorgrim then leads his army from 8 Peaks to Black Crag to reinforce Karak Azul's army, and they sack it. They smash the gates down, they go inside, they save the hostages, they kill a ton of greenskins, but without Gorfang there, the hold falls to the dwarfs. But they can't occupy it because they don't have the numbers, they don't have everything they would need to do it, and it's a infested hellhole, is basically the way Thorgrim puts it, where Thorgrim refuses to even speak what he sees in there. He's just like, we're going to come back at some point and just burn this place to the ground. And they all leave. And Gorfang's head is presented to Khazador, and Khazador goes, Thorgrim, I'll do anything you want. Anything you want. And Thorgrim goes, cool, and calls on him later in the end times to do some stuff, and Khazador does it. Frankly, it's a pretty straightforward storyline, and the reason it's so straightforward is because it didn't happen in the end times, it happened before the end times.
And then the end times happens.
Yeah. And it kind of goes to show that, wow, when they took their time over several Black Library books and army books, they actually told a great story. It's really good. Like, Gorfang's death is one of the better deaths in that setup for the end times. So I love this entire story. I thought it was nicely handled. I followed it at the time, which because I was deeply into getting back into Warhammer at the time, and I remember going, well, that's a shame because I like the character, but it's a really nice end. Love that. Then the end times happened. Gorfang got out of there quick. He's like, I'm getting out before this stuff gets shit.
No. Gorfang's mentioned in the end times again. He's not dead. He's dead. Yeah. So go back through I think it's the End Times collection. I can't remember which one, and it suggests Belagar kills him because the End Times didn't do its frickin' homework.
Clearly a ridiculous rumor.
Yeah, totally. So, the end times come along, and Gorfang is suddenly not actually dead, and Belagar's killed him, and it doesn't make any sense at all. And you'll find that's one of the many reasons I have issues with the end times, because it was clearly rushed. They didn't do all of the necessary reading to finish all of the stories. And Thorgrim's killing of what was probably one of the...
that's in book 4, which is a mess.
I can't remember which book it's in. I just remember it in the back of my head.
Book 4 is a fucking disaster.
Yeah, I need to... I will go check it up, because I remember the detail, because I remember being livid at the time.
It's almost time for us to do another rage stream on the end times. It really
is almost time to do another hate stream about the end times.
That wall energy is building up.
Yeah, totally. But it's a perfect example of the issues that I had with the end times material, and that was they took all of the characters they thought they would tell stories about, told some bad stories, and sometimes wrote over good stories. And for all I was sad to see Rotgut die, because he hadn't been a primary character for a long time. Seeing him get so much extra detail, seeing him be used as the primary antagonist and then eventually brought down by Thorgrim, I thought was great. It was a really nice end to the whole story, and it also gave that little glimmer of hope, that sliver of possibility of the dwarfs being able to reclaim something that had been lost for 3,000 years. And it was a lovely little stop. It became in the dwarf army list nothing more than a drop of, and Thorgrim went over there, kind of had his ass handed to him and left, which isn't exactly how the books put it, but it was certainly one way of putting it inside the army list. As is often the case with the army lists, they give a summary that's not necessarily accurate to the novels.
Note in the timeline section.
And it's also worth noting that as far as the army lists are concerned, Black Library books are not, generally speaking, to be paid attention to. They're nothing more than sources for the army list to go, oh, that's an interesting fact, I'll take that one. And the rest of it, I'm going to ignore and contradict, because the studio is the core, not the novels.
Yeah, what was interesting in this case was that the Thorgrim novella was released as a pre-order for the Dwarf 8th edition army book, which was the rare exception. Which was, it worked great. I wish they'd done that for all the books. That would have been nice.
It would have been really nice. It was right at the end of the Warhammer release schedules, though. So clearly it was, we're going to do it this way, and then they just stopped doing Warhammer.
There were so many things in 8th edition that there's an alternate universe where they had, like, between Tarmacon, the Monstrous Arcanum, these novellas to reinforce the army books. Man, things are about to get really good.
They were about to get really, really good for Warhammer, which is one of the reasons why the end times, when it came, disappointed so many people, because they were filled with Warhammer's getting cool shit sense of feeling, and then suddenly Warhammer's gone. Completely.
What that Games Workshop cares about fantasy now, as Games Workshop's approaching with a shotgun.
Yes, we care. Bang! Old Yeller. So yeah, that was a fun time, definitely.
Anyway,
cool. So that's what happened to the place. It got kind of reclaimed, and then the world blew up. So that'll do.
Yeah. Chad Pearson, here's more teeth to support the best Warhammer Lorebeards out there. Cheers to you both. Well, thank you, Chad.
Thanks, Chad. Appreciated.
Singemeister, Moors aside, who's Gorfang's biggest Skaven threat? I mean, Moors is definitely the big one in that ballpark.
Moors.
Besides, maybe Rictus. I mean, Crookback Mountain is not that far away. It's just on the other side of Death Pass, kinda. So I guess Rictus.
What I find interesting about Gorfang's setup is that apparently, unlike, I would suggest, every other dwarf hold, this hold is not filled with Skaven at the base. Generally, you get the layering. You've got some sort of horrible monster, the Skaven, the Greenskins, then the dwarfs. And when it gets taken out, the Greenskins take the top layer and the second layer, and we end up with Skaven still undermining them, and the monsters at the bottom, who knows what they are. But in this case, the Skaven constantly come from the outside and try to come in, suggesting that the orcs have properly got this under control in a way that is really, really rare, which again makes this place super cool.
Yeah, Clan Moors isn't able to get anywhere close to Black Crag, which is fascinating. Like, their territory just stops dead when it gets into Gorfang's territory. Which is cool. Let's see. Laughing God. Thorgrim saw the counting houses in exchange with horror on his face and burned it.
One tooth, two tooth, lots of teeth.
That was
Two socket many.
That's the true secret. We thought the horrors are the defacing of the dwarf thing, and it's really he saw Greenskin economics and was like, absolutely not. Absolutely
A step too far.
Sen, England right now has a right-wing wah incursion.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's almost like we returned to the 80s in some weird way over parts of England just now.
More into GW. Yeah, GW being GW,
Gladiators.
they'd be called Gladiators. Gladiators.
Gladiators ready.
I hate to say it, but yeah, you're right.
You're probably right.
That's exactly what they would be called. All right, Andy, it's time to wrap up. If you got our
It is
outro.
time to wrap up. So my summary for this one's going to be pretty short, and it's going to be largely what you expect. Black Crag is, I think, a super fascinating orc fortress. The reason being because we actually get some detail of what it's like when the orcs get their shit together. And we also get this pretty obvious long-term relationship that orcs have with bastions. This is 3,000 years old. This isn't a quick place that's been sacked. Orcs have been living there for a while, squatting in the place. No matter what the dwarfs may say with their squatter king nonsense, 3,000 years of orc dominance in the area. And this 3,000 years shows an orc civilization that has moved much beyond the simple warg retreat that Games Workshop often focuses upon. It has shown a complete civilization that not only trades, it sends embassies, it deals with people passing through and taxes them. It has its own civilization internally. It's managed to hold out the Skaven. It's managed to hold off the dwarfs to the point that it's sending commando raids over towards local holds and yanking people out. It holds dwarf prisoners on purpose. There is a host of exceedingly fun details that are dropped into this area, and it starts to open up what orcs are to the eye. We begin to realize that this is what they probably are like, again, manifesting in different ways in each individual place, but what they're like elsewhere. We have Orc Civilization, and this goes contrary to generally how they're presented inside the army lists, because the army lists focus on the Wah and the great forward force, because that's what you're generally playing with. But behind that, there are the orc fortresses, the orc warlords who sit at the back, who are in some respects both fueling and using these WAs. So that being the case, it opens our eyes to the idea that orcs are much more than how the army lists present them, or indeed how some of the various novels present them. They are a deeper, more complex, and potentially even, dare I say it, thoughtful species, particularly when you look at someone like Gorfang Rotgut, who has been king there for anything up to a century, probably at least 60 years, and is himself centuries old, and controls the surrounding area like a feudal king, with almost as much control as any other human feudal king. And it makes you go, well, wait a minute, what? Which again, from my perspective, where I always like looking at the roleplay side, completely explodes the species as a playable species. This is no longer a species that's nothing more than a charge out and hit everything species, a little bit like a Slayer. Many people think Slayers don't make great PCs, but we did a Slayer stream. We would contradict that in many respects. But the orcs make a great PC race. They make a great race to play. In fact, I would argue that they make one of the better ones of the Warhammer world, because they are both very different to the other various factions, species, or whatever, but they also bring something that's uniquely Warhammer to the table, because greenskins in the Warhammer world are so unlike the orcs and the goblins and everything else that you get in D&D or any of the other fantasy games out there. They are unique and fun, and it's because of this place, Carrick Draz, that we can say, yes, greenskins in Warhammer kick ass and are cool.
And I will say that if you're like, wow, that orc PC idea sounds fun, the core thing to any orc or greenskin campaign, not just orcs, but goblins as well, is that it should be funny. There should be a lot of laughter and humor. which is why you should go check out the Rookery Publications YouTube channel
well
for their
done.
most recent stream on humor and roleplay games.
Oh, that was slick.
That was good.
That was good. So yeah, if you haven't checked that already, we did a stream just last night about using humor inside your roleplay games and why it's super important and how it can be used even in the most grimmest and darkest of games. And an orc game could be super grim and super dark, given what much of the subject matter would revolve around.
So yeah, I was proud of that transition.
Yeah, that was good.
Phil, you guys should definitely consider doing a Badlands stream at some point. Lots of interesting, not well. Yeah, oh jeez, I don't even know how we'd have to
the
break it
freaking
into
Badlands.
Yeah, the Badlands is like that's like saying, oh, you should do like an Empire stream. Like there's a lot of shit, especially because of that that one particular book. There's a lot on the Badlands,
which is good because it gives us something to mine.
All right. Anyway, that's our time.
Thanks, all. You rock.
Yeah. We hope you all enjoyed the stream and you had a really good time and enjoyed learning about Greenskin's civilization. I'm really pleased with how we were able to. This one was good. This was a very good one.
It was a good one. I thought we covered an awful lot of stuff that very easily couldn't have been. I was a little bit concerned, as I often am at the beginning of a stream. Do we have enough to discuss here? We didn't only have enough. We had tons to cover. And a lot of it, I think, was really interesting because most people generally don't think of greenskins this way. And it wouldn't have come up as a topic if it hadn't been for Carrick Draz, if it hadn't been for Black Crag. So thanks very much for selecting it.
Yeah. I'm half tempted to like get off stream and send this one to the Creative Assembly devs and be like, "This is why Gorfang Rotgut, Legendary Lord, please." So you understand.
Totally.
Anyway, make sure you join us this Wednesday at 5 p.m. CST, 11 p.m. BST for some Total War Warhammer. Should be a really good time. I'm gonna warn you all now. It's gonna be a pretty casual stream where we're probably gonna be more discussing lore and like chatting about what you guys are saying to us and just having a good time. It's not gonna be a super intense gameplay stream. More than likely, I'm just warning you now. Set your expectations.
We'll see how it lands, huh?
Other than that, be sure to join us next week on the Loremaster of Sotek channel for... I should have pulled it up a second ago, but I'm pulling it up now.
What we doing, Loremaster of Sotek?
Pretty sure I know the answer, but I don't want to accidentally say it and then be wrong. Oh, come on.
I'm going to guess it's Vampire Coast.
It is the Vampire Coast.
Not a surprise.
Fortune indeed favors the infamous. So that's going to be an interesting one. So be sure to join us for the Vampire Coast of Lustria next week. And to be clear, we're talking about the place, not the faction. Though obviously the faction plays into it. But it should be a really good time. And there will be a new vote up on this channel, the LAWhammer channel, here in just a little bit.
Yep, certainly will. So thanks very much, all. You all kick ass and rock. And we look forward to seeing you for the next episode of Lorebeards. Until then.
Bye-bye!
Better switch it off, eh?